The Overcoat by Nikolai Gogol. Once in a bureaucracy, but better not mention which bureaucracy, there is nothing touchier than bureaucracies, regiments, bureaus, in fact any caste of officials. Things have reached the point where every individual takes an insult to himself as a slur on society as a whole. It seems that not long ago a complaint was lodged by the police inspector of I forget which town, in which he stated clearly that government institutions had been imperiled and his own sacred name taken in vain. In evidence he produced a huge volume, practically a novel, in which every 10 pages a police inspector appears, and what's more, at times completely drunk. So, to stay out of trouble, let us refer to it just as a bureaucracy. And so, once in a bureaucracy, there worked a clerk. This clerk was nothing much to speak of. He was small, somewhat pock-marked, his hair was somewhat reddish, and he even looked somewhat blind. Moreover, he was getting thin on top, had wrinkled cheeks, and a complexion that might be aptly described as hemorrhoidal. But that's the Petersburg climate for you. As to his civil service category, for first a man's standing should be established, he was what is called an eternal pen-pusher, a lowly 9th-class clerk, the usual butt of the jeers and jokes of those writers who have the congenial habit of biting those who cannot bite back. The clerk's name was Shoenick. There is no doubt that this name derives from shoe, but we know nothing of how, why, or when. His father, his grandfather, and even his brother-in-law wore boots, having new soles put on them not more than 3 times a year. His first name was Akaky, like his father's, which made him Akaky Akakivich. This may sound somewhat strange and contrived, but it is not contrived at all, and in view of the circumstances any other name was unthinkable. If I am not mistaken, Akaky Akakivich was born on the night between the 22nd and the 23rd of March. His late mother, an excellent woman and the wife of a clerk, had made all the arrangements for the child's christening, and while she was still confined to her bed, the godparents arrived. The worthy Ivan Yeroshkin, head clerk in the Senate, and Arina Witetumkin, the wife of a police captain, a woman of rare virtue. The new mother was given her pick of the following 3 names for her son: Mokius, Circeus, and that of the martyr Hotzazat.
"That won't do,"
Akaky's late mother thought.
"Those names are, how shall I put it?"
To please her, the godparents opened the calendar at another page, and again 3 names came out: Strephilius, Dulius, and Varacasius.
"We're in a mess,"
the old woman said.
"Who ever heard of such names? If it was something like Varadat or Varuk, I wouldn't object. But Strephilius and Varacasius?"
So they turned to yet another page, and out came Pavsikakius and Vactisius.
"Well, that's that,"
the mother said.
"That settles it. He'll just have to be Akaky like his father."
So, that's how Akaky Akakivich originated. And when they christened the child, it cried and twisted its features into a sour expression, as though it had a foreboding that it would become a 9th-class clerk. Well, that's how it all happened, and it has been reported here just to show that the child couldn't have been called anything but Akaky. No one remembers who helped him get his appointment to the bureaucracy, or when he started working there. Directors and all sorts of chiefs came and went, but he was always to be found at the same place, in the same position, and in the same capacity, that of copying clerk. Until, after a while, people began to believe that he must have been born just as he was, shabby frock-coat, bald patch, and all. In the office not the slightest respect was shown him. The porters didn't get up when he passed. In fact, they didn't even raise their eyes, as if nothing but an ordinary fly had passed through the reception-room. His chiefs were cold and despotic with him. Some head clerks would thrust a paper under his nose without even saying, "Copy this," or "Here's a nice interesting little job for you," or some such pleasant remark as is current in well-bred offices, and Akaky Akakiyevich would take the paper without glancing up to see who had put it under his nose or whether the person was entitled to do so, and right away he would set about copying it. The young clerks laughed at him and played tricks on him to the limit of their clerkish wit. They made up stories about him and told them in front of him. They said that his 70-year-old landlady beat him and asked him when the wedding would be. They scattered scraps of paper which they said was snow over his head. But with all this going on, Akaky Akakiyevich never said a word, and even acted as though no one were there. It didn't even affect his work, and in spite of their loud badgering, he made no mistakes in his copying. Only when they tormented him unbearably, when they jogged his elbow and prevented him from getting on with his work, would he say, "Let me be. Why do you do this to me?" And his words and the way he said them sounded strange. There was something touching about them. Once a young man who was new to the office started to tease him, following the crowd. Suddenly he stopped, as if awakened from a trance, and after that he couldn't stand the others, whom at first he had deemed decent people, and for a long time to come, during his gayest moments, he would suddenly see in his mind's eye the little balding clerk, and he would hear the words, "Let me be. Why do you do this to me?" And within those words rang the phrase, "I am your brother." And the young man would cover his face with his hands. Later in life he often shuddered, musing about the wickedness of man toward man, and all the cruelty and vulgarity which are concealed under refined manners. And this, he decided, was also true of men who were considered upright and honorable. It would be hard to find a man who so lived for his job. It would not be enough to say that he worked conscientiously. He worked with love. There, in his copying, he found an interesting, pleasant world for himself, and his delight was reflected in his face. He had his favourites among the letters of the alphabet, and when he came to them, he would chuckle, wink, and help them along with his lips, so that they could almost be read on his face as they were formed by his pen. Had he been rewarded in proportion with his zeal, he would, perhaps to his own surprise, have been promoted to fifth-class clerk. But all he got out of it was, as his witty colleagues put it, a pen for his buttonhole, and hemorrhoids to sit on. Still, it would be unfair to say that no attention had ever been paid him. One of the successive directors, a kindly man who thought Akaky Akakiyevich should be rewarded for his long service, suggested that he be given something more interesting than ordinary copying. So he was asked to prepare an already drawn-up document for referral to another department. Actually, all he had to do was to give it a new heading and change some of the verbs from the first to the third person. But Akaky Akakiyevich found this work so complicated that he broke into a sweat, and finally, mopping his brow, he said, "Oh, no, I would rather have something to copy instead." After that, they left him to his copying forever, and aside from it seemed, nothing existed for him. He never gave a thought to his clothes. His frock-coat, which was supposed to be green, had turned a sort of mealy reddish. Its collar was very low and very narrow, so that his neck, which was really quite ordinary, looked incredibly long, like the spring necks of the head-shaking plaster kittens which foreign peddlers carry around on their heads on trays. And somehow there was always something stuck to Akaky Akakiyevich's frock-coat. A wisp of hay, a little thread. Then, too, he had a knack of passing under windows just when refuse happened to be thrown out, and as a result was forever carrying around on his hat melon rinds and other such rubbish. Never did he pay any attention to what was going on around him in the street. In this he was very different from the other members of the pen-pushing brotherhood, who are so keen-eyed and observant that they'll notice an undone strap on the bottom of someone's trousers, an observation that unfailingly moulds their features into a sly sneer. But even when Akaky Akakiyevich's eyes were resting on something, he saw superimposed on it his own well-formed, neat handwriting. Perhaps it was only when, out of nowhere, a horse rested its head on his shoulder and sent a blast of wind down his cheek, that he realized he was not in the middle of a line, but in the middle of a street. When he got home, he would sit straight down to the table and quickly gulp his cabbage soup, followed by beef and onions. He never noticed the taste, and ate it with flies and whatever else God happened to send along. When his stomach began to feel bloated, he would get up from the table, take out his inkwell, and copy papers he had brought with him from the office. And if there weren't any papers to copy for the office, he would make a copy for his own pleasure, especially if the document were unusual. Unusual, not for the beauty of its style, but because it was addressed to some new or important personage. Even during those hours when light has completely disappeared from the grey Petersburg sky, and the pen-pushing brotherhood have filled themselves with dinner of one sort or another, each as best he can according to his income and his preference, when everyone has rested from the scraping of pens in the office, from running around on their own and others' errands, when the restless human being has relaxed after the tasks, sometimes unnecessary, he sets himself, and the clerks hasten to give over the remaining hours to pleasure, the more surprising among them rushes to the theatre, another walks in the streets, allotting his time to the inspection of ladies' hats. Another spends his evening paying compliments to some prettyish damsel, the queen of a small circle of clerks. Another, the most frequent case, goes to visit a brother clerk, who lives somewhere on the 3rd or 4th floor, in 2 small rooms, with a hall of a kitchen and some little pretensions to fashion, a lamp or some other article bought at great sacrifice, such as going without dinner or outside pleasures. In brief, at the time when all clerks have dispersed among the lodgings of their friends to play a little game of whist, sipping tea from glasses and nibbling biscuits, inhaling the smoke from their long pipes, relaying, while the cards are dealt, some bit of gossip that has trickled down from high society, a thing which a Russian cannot do without, whatever his circumstances, and even when there's nothing else to talk about, telling once again the ancient joke about the commandant to whom it was reported that someone had hacked the tail off the horse of the monument to Peter I. In a word, when everyone else was trying to have a good time, Akaky Akakiyevich was not even thinking of diverting himself. No one had ever seen him at a party in the evening. Having written to his heart's content, he would go to bed, smiling in anticipation of the morrow, of what God would send him to copy. Thus flowed the life of a man who, on a yearly salary of 400 roubles, was content with his lot. And perhaps it would have flowed on to old age, if it hadn't been for the various disasters which are scattered along life's paths, not only for 9th-class clerks, but even for 8th, 7th, 6th-class clerks, and all the way up to state councillors, privy councillors, and even to those who counsel no one, not even themselves. In Petersburg, there's a formidable enemy for all those who receive a salary in the neighbourhood of 400 roubles a year. The enemy is none other than our northern cold, although they say it's very healthy. Between 8 and 9 in the morning, at just the time when the streets are filled with people walking to their offices, the cold starts to mete out indiscriminately such hard, stinging flicks on noses that the wretched clerks don't know where to put them, and when the cold pinches the brows and brings tears to the eyes of those in high positions, 9th-class clerks are completely defenceless. They can only wrap themselves in their threadbare overcoats and run as fast as they can the 5 or 6 blocks to the office. Once arrived, they have to stamp their feet in the vestibule until their abilities and talents, which have been frozen on the way, thaw out once again. Akaky Akakiyevich had noticed that for some time the cold had been attacking his back and shoulders quite viciously, try as he might to sprint the prescribed distance. He finally began to wonder whether the fault did not lie with his overcoat. When he gave it a good looking over in his room, he discovered that in 2 or 3 places, the shoulders and back, it had become very much like gauze. The cloth was torn so thin that it let the draught in, and to make things worse, the lining had disintegrated. It must be noted that Akaky Akakiyevich's overcoat had also been a butt of the clerk's jokes. They had even deprived it of its respectable name, referring to it as the old dressing-gown. And as far as that goes, it did have a strange shape. Its collar shrank with every year, since it was used to patch other areas, and the patching, which did not flatter the tailor, made the overcoat baggy and ugly. Having located the trouble, Akaky Akakiyevich decided to take the cloak to Petrovich, a tailor who lived somewhere on the 4th floor, up a back stairs, and who, one-eyed and pock-marked as he was still quite good at repairing clerks' and other such people's trousers and frock-coats, provided he happened to be sober and hadn't other things on his mind. We shouldn't, of course, waste too many words on the tailor, but since it has become the fashion to give a thorough description of every character figuring in a story, there's nothing to be done but to give you Petrovich. At first he was called just Grigory, and was the serf of some gentleman or other. He began to call himself Petrovich when he received his freedom, and took to drinking rather heavily on all holidays, on the big ones at first, and then, without distinction, on all church holidays, on any day marked by a little cross on the calendar. In this he was true to the traditions of his forefathers, and when his wife nagged him about it, he called her impious and a German. Now that we've mentioned his wife, we'd better say a word or two about her too. But unfortunately very little is known about her, except that Petrovich had a wife who wore a bonnet instead of a kerchief, but was apparently no beauty, since on meeting her it occurred to no one but an occasional soldier to peek under that bonnet of hers, twitching his moustache and making gurgling sounds. Going up the stairs leading to Petrovich's place, which, to be honest about it, was saturated with water and slops, and exuded that ammonia smell which burns your eyes and which you'll always find on the back stairs of all Petersburg houses, going up those stairs, Akaky Akakiyevich was already conjecturing how much Petrovich would ask, and making up his mind not to pay more than 2 roubles. The door stood open because Petrovich's wife was cooking some fish or other, and had made so much smoke in the kitchen that you couldn't even see the cockroaches. Akaky Akakiyevich went through the kitchen without even seeing Mrs. Petrovich, and finally reached the other room, where he saw Petrovich sitting on a wide, unpainted wooden table, with his legs crossed under him like a Turkish pasha. He was barefoot, as tailors at work usually are, and the first thing Akaky Akakiyevich saw was Petrovich's big toe, with its twisted nail, thick and hard like a tortoise-shell. A skein of silk and cotton thread hung around Petrovich's neck. On his knees there was some old garment. For the past 3 minutes he had been trying to thread his needle, very irritated at the darkness of the room and even with the thread itself, muttering under his breath, "It won't go through, the pig! It's killing me, the bitch!" Akaky Akakiyevich was unhappy to find Petrovich so irritated. He preferred to negotiate when the tailor was a little under the weather, or, as his wife put it, when the one-eyed buzzard had a load on. When caught in such a state, Petrovich usually gave way very readily on the price, and would even thank Akaky Akakiyevich with respectful bows and all that. True, afterwards his wife would come whining that her husband had charged too little because he was drunk, but all you had to do was to add 10 kopecks, and it was a deal. This time, however, Petrovich seemed to be sober, and therefore curt, intractable, and likely to charge an outrageous price. Akaky Akakiyevich realized this, and would have liked to beat a hasty retreat, but the die was cast. Petrovich had fixed his one eye on him, and Akaky Akakiyevich involuntarily came out with, "Hello, Petrovich." "Wish you good day, sir," said Petrovich, and bent his eye toward Akaky Akakiyevich's hands to see what kind of spoil he had brought him. "Well, Petrovich, I've come. The thing is, Too, it should be realized that Akaky Akakiyevich used all sorts of prepositions, adverbs, and all those meaningless little parts of speech when he spoke. Moreover, if the matter were very involved, he generally didn't finish his sentences and opened them with the words, "This, really, is absolutely, I mean to say," and then nothing more. He had forgotten that he hadn't said what he wanted to. "What is it, then?" Petrovich asked, looking over Akaky Akakiyevich's frock coat with his one eye, the collar, the sleeves, the back, the tails, the buttonholes, all of which he was already acquainted with, since, repairs and all, it was his own work. That's just what tailors do as soon as they see you.
"Well, it's like this, Petrovich. My cloak, the material, look, you can see everywhere else it's very strong. Well, it's a bit dusty and it looks rather shabby, but it's not really. Look, it's just in one place. It's a little on the back here, and here too. It's a little worn, and here on the shoulder too, a little, and that's all. There's not much work."
Petrovich took Akaky Akakiyevich's old dressing-gown, as his colleagues called it, spread it out on the table, and looked it over at length. Then he shook his head, and, stretching out his hand, took from the window-sill a snuff-box, embellished with the portrait of a general, though just what general it was impossible to tell, since right where his face used to be there was now a dent glued over with a piece of paper. Taking some snuff, Petrovich spread the overcoat out on his hands, held it up against the light, and again shook his head. Then he turned the overcoat inside out with the lining up, and shook his head again. Then, once more, he removed the snuff-box lid with its general under the piece of paper, and, stuffing snuff into his nose, closed the box, put it away, and finally said, "No, it can't be mended. It's no use." At these words, Akaky Akakiyevich's heart turned over.
"But why can't it be, Petrovich?"
he said in the imploring voice of a child.
"Look, the only trouble is that it's worn round the shoulders. I'm sure you have some scraps of cloth."
"As for scraps, I suppose I could find them," Petrovich said, "but I couldn't sew them on. The whole thing is rotten. It'd go to pieces the moment you touched it with a needle."
"Well, if it starts to go, you'll catch it with a patch."
"But there's nothing but patches to hold to. It's too far gone. It's only cloth in name. A puff of wind and it'll disintegrate."
"Still, I'm sure you can make them hold just the same. Otherwise, really, Petrovich, you see what I mean?"
"No," Petrovich said with finality. "Nothing can be done with it. It's just no good. You'd better make yourself some bands out of it to wrap around your legs when it's cold, and socks aren't enough to keep you warm. The Germans thought up those things to make money for themselves." Petrovich liked to take a dig at the Germans whenever there was a chance. "As to your overcoat, it looks as if you'll have to have a new one made." At the word "new," Akaky Akakiyevich's vision became foggy, and the whole room began to sway. The only thing he saw clearly was the general with the paper-covered face on the lid of Petrovich's snuff-box.
"What do you mean, a new one?"
he said, talking as if in a dream.
"I haven't even got the money."
"A new one," Petrovich repeated, with savage calm.
"Well, but if I really had to have a new one, how would it be that—"
"That is, what will it cost?"
"Yes."
"Well, it will be over 150 roubles," Petrovich said, pursing his lips meaningfully. He liked strong effects. He liked to perplex someone suddenly, and then observe the grimace that his words produced.
150 roubles for an overcoat!"
shrieked the poor Akaky Akakiyevich, shrieked perhaps for the first time in his life, since he was always noted for his quietness. "Yes, sir," said Petrovich, "but what an overcoat! And if it is to have marten on the collar and a silk-lined hood, I'll bring it up to 200.
"Please, Petrovich, please,"
Akaky Akakiyevich said beseechingly, not taking in Petrovich's words or noticing his dramatic effects.
"Mend it somehow. just enough to make it last a little longer."
"No, sir, it won't work. It will be a waste of labour and money."
Akaky Akakiyevich left completely crushed, and when he left, Petrovich, instead of going back to his work, remained for a long time immobile, his lips pursed meaningfully. He was pleased with himself for having upheld his own honour as well as that of the entire tailoring profession. Akaky Akakiyevich emerged into the street, feeling as if he were in a dream.
"So, that's it,"
he repeated to himself.
"I never suspected it would turn out this way."
And then, after a brief pause, he went on.
"So that's it. Here's how it turns out in the end, and I really simply couldn't have foreseen it."
After another longer pause, he added,
"And so here we are. Here's how things stand. I in no way expected. But this is impossible. What a business."
Muttering thus, instead of going home, he went in the opposite direction, without having the slightest idea of what was going on. As he was walking, a chimney-sweep brushed his dirty side against him and blackened his whole shoulder. A whole bucketful of lime was showered over him from the top of a house under construction. But he noticed nothing, and only when he bumped into a watchman who, resting his halberd near him, was shaking some stuff out of a horn into his calloused palm, did he come to a little, and that only because the watchman said,
"You have to knock my head off. You got the whole sidewalk, ain't you?"
This caused him to look about him and turn back toward home. Only then did he start to collect his thoughts and to see his real position clearly. He began to talk to himself, not in bits of phrases now, but sensibly, as to a wise friend in whom he could confide.
"Oh, no," he said. "This wasn't the moment to speak to Petrovich. Right now he's sort of... His wife obviously has been giving him a beating. That sort of thing. It'd be better if I went and saw him Sunday morning. After Saturday night, his one eye will be wandering, and he'll be tired and in need of another drink, and his wife won't give him the money. So I'll slip him a quarter, and that will make him more reasonable, and so, for the overcoat."
Thus Akaky Akakiyevich tried to reassure himself, and persuaded himself to wait for Sunday. When that day came, he waited at a distance until he saw Petrovich's wife leave the house, and then went up. After his Saturday night libations, Petrovich's eye certainly was wandering. He hung his head and looked terribly sleepy. But despite all that, as soon as he learned what Akaky Akakiyevich had come about, it was as if the devil had poked him.
"It can't be done," he said. "You must order a new one."
Here Akaky Akakiyevich pressed the quarter on him.
"Thank you," Petrovich said. "I'll drink a short one to you, sir. And as to the overcoat, you can stop worrying. It's worthless. But I'll make you a first-rate new one. That I'll see to."
Akaky Akakiyevich tried once more to bring the conversation around to mending, but Petrovich, instead of listening, said,
"I'll make you a new one, sir. You can count on me to do my best. I may even make the collar fasten with silver-plated clasps for you."
At this point, Akaky Akakiyevich saw that he'd have to have a new overcoat, and he became utterly depressed. Where was he going to get the money? There was, of course, the next holiday bonus, but the sum involved had long ago been allotted to other needs. He had to order new trousers, to pay the cobbler for replacing the tops on his boots. He owed the seamstress for 3 shirts, and simply had to have 2 items of underwear, which one cannot refer to in print. In fact, all the money to the last kopeck was owed, and even if the director made an unexpectedly generous gesture and allotted him, instead of 40 roubles, a whole 45 or even 50, the difference would be a drop in the ocean in the overcoat outlay. It is true, Akaky Akakiyevich knew that, on occasions, Petrovich slapped on heaven knows what exorbitant price, so that even his wife couldn't refrain from exclaiming,
"Have you gone mad, you fool? One day he accepts work for nothing, and the next something gets into him and makes him ask for more than he's worth himself."
but he also knew that Petrovitch would agree to make him a new overcoat for 80 roubles. Even so, where was he to find the 80? He could perhaps scrape together half that sum, even a little more. But where would he get the other half? Let us, however, start with the first half and see where it was to come from. Akaky Akakiyevich had a rule. Whenever he spent 1 rouble, he slipped a copper into a little box with a slot in its side. Every 6 months he counted the coppers and changed them for silver. He'd been doing this for a long time, and after all these years had accumulated more than 40 roubles. So this came to 1/2. But what about the remaining 40 roubles? Akaky Akakiyevich thought and decided that he would have to reduce his regular expenses for an entire year, at least. It would mean going without his evening tea, not burning candles at night, and, if he absolutely had to have light, going to his landlady's room and working by her candle. It would mean, when walking in the street, stepping as carefully as possible over the cobbles and paving stones, almost tiptoeing, so as not to wear out the soles of his boots too rapidly, and giving out his laundry as seldom as possible, and, so that it shouldn't get too soiled, undressing as soon as he got home and staying in just his thin cotton dressing-gown, which, if time hadn't taken pity on, would itself have collapsed long ago. It must be admitted that, at first, he suffered somewhat from these restrictions, but then he became accustomed to them somehow, and things went smoothly again. He even got used to going hungry in the evenings, but then he was able to feed himself spiritually, carrying within him the eternal idea of his overcoat to be. It was as if his existence had become somehow fuller, as if he had married and another human being were there with him, as if he were no longer alone on life's road, but walking by the side of a delightful companion. And that companion was none other than the overcoat itself, with its thick padding and strong lining that would last forever. In some way he became more alive, even stronger-minded, like a man who has determined his ultimate goal in life. From his face and actions all the marks of vacillation and indecision vanished. At times there was even a fire in his eyes, and the boldest, wildest notions flashed through his head. Perhaps he should really consider having Martin put on the collar. The intensity of these thoughts almost distracted his attention from his work. Once he almost made a mistake which caused him to exclaim, true, very softly, "Ooh!" and to cross himself. At least once each month he looked in on Petrovitch to discuss the overcoat, the best place to buy the material, its colour, its price. Then, on the way home, a little worried but always pleased, he mused about how, finally, all this buying would be over and the coat would be made. Things went ahead faster than he had expected. Beyond all expectations, the director granted Akaky Akakiyevich not 40, not 45, but a whole 60 roubles. Could he have had a premonition that Akaky Akakiyevich needed a new overcoat, or had it just happened by itself? Whatever it was, Akaky Akakiyevich wound up with an extra 20 roubles. This circumstance speeded matters up. Another 2 or 3 months of moderate hunger, and he had almost all of the 80 roubles he needed. His heartbeat, generally very quiet, grew faster. As soon as he could, he set out for the store with Petrovitch. They bought excellent material, which is not surprising, since they had been planning the move for all of 6 months, and a month had seldom gone by without Akaky Akakiyevich dropping into the shop to work out prices. Petrovitch himself said that there was no better material to be had. For the lining they chose calico, but so good and thick that Petrovitch said it even looked better and glossier than silk. They did not buy marten, because it was too expensive. Instead, they got cat, the best available. Cat, which at a distance could always be taken for marten. Petrovitch spent 2 full weeks on the overcoat because of all the quilting he had to do. He charged 12 roubles for his work. It was impossible to take less. It had been sewn with silk, with fine double seams, and Petrovitch had gone over each seam again afterwards with his own teeth, squeezing out different patterns with them. It was, well, it's hard to say exactly which day it was, but it was probably the most solemn day in Akaky Akakiyevich's life. The day Petrovich finally brought him the overcoat. He brought it in the morning, just before it was time to go to the office. There couldn't have been a better moment for the coat to arrive, because cold spells had been creeping in and threatened to become even more severe. Petrovich appeared with the coat, as befits a good tailor. He had an expression of importance on his face that Akaky Akakiyevich had never seen before. He looked very much aware of having performed an important act, an act that carries tailors over the chasm which separates those who merely put in linings and do repairs from those who create. He took the overcoat out of the gigantic handkerchief, just fresh from the wash, in which he had wrapped it to deliver it. The handkerchief he folded neatly and put in his pocket, ready for use. Then he took the coat, looked at it with great pride, and, holding it in both hands, threw it quite deftly around Akaky Akakiyevich's shoulders. He pulled and smoothed it down at the back, wrapped it around Akaky Akakiyevich, leaving it a little open at the front. Akaky Akakiyevich, a down-to-earth sort of man, wanted to try out the sleeves. Petrovich helped him to pull his arms through, and it turned out that, with the sleeves, too, it was good. In a word, it was clear that the coat fitted perfectly. Petrovich didn't fail to take advantage of the occasion to remark that it was only because he did without a signboard, lived in a small side street, and had known Akaky Akakiyevich for a long time, that he had charged him so little. On Nevsky Avenue nowadays, he said, they'd have taken 75 rubles for the work alone. Akaky Akakiyevich had no desire to debate the point with Petrovich. He was always rather awed by the big sums which Petrovich liked to mention to impress people. He paid up, thanked Petrovich, and left for the office, wearing his new overcoat. Petrovich followed him, and stood for a long time in the street, gazing at the overcoat from a distance. Then he plunged into a curving side street, took a shortcut, and re-emerged on the street ahead of Akaky Akakiyevich, so that he could have another look at the coat from another angle. Meanwhile, Akaky Akakiyevich walked on, bubbling with good spirits. Every second of every minute he felt the new overcoat on his shoulders, and several times he even let out a little chuckle of inward pleasure. Indeed, the overcoat presented him with a double advantage. It was warm, and it was good. He didn't notice his trip at all, and suddenly found himself before the office building. In the porter's lodge he slipped off the overcoat, inspected it, and entrusted it to the porter's special care. No one knows how, but it suddenly became general knowledge in the office that Akaky Akakiyevich had a new overcoat, and that the old dressing-gown no longer existed. Elbowing one another, they all rushed to the cloak-room to see the new coat. Then they proceeded to congratulate him. He smiled at first, but then the congratulations became too exuberant, and he felt embarrassed. And when they surrounded him and started trying to persuade him that the very least he could do was to invite them over one evening to drink to the coat, Akaky Akakiyevich felt completely at a loss, didn't know what to do with himself, what to say, or how to talk himself out of it. And a few minutes later, all red in the face, he was trying, rather naively, to convince them that it wasn't a new overcoat at all, that it wasn't much, that it was an old one. In the end, a clerk, no less a person than an assistant to the head clerk, probably wanting to show that he wasn't too proud to mingle with those beneath him, said, "All right, then, I'll do it instead of Akaky Akakiyevich. I invite you all over for a party. Come over to my place tonight. Incidentally, it happens to be my birthday today." Naturally, the clerks now congratulated the head clerk's assistant, and happily accepted his invitation. Akaky Akakiyevich started to excuse himself, but he was told that it would be rude on his part, a disgrace, so he had to give way in the end. And later he was even rather pleased that he had accepted, since it would give him an opportunity to wear the new coat in the evening, too. Akaky Akakiyevich felt as if it were a holiday. he arrived home in the happiest frame of mind, took off the overcoat, hung it up very carefully on the wall, and gave the material and the lining one more admiring inspection. Then he took out that ragged item known as the old dressing-gown, and put it next to the new overcoat, looked at it, and began to laugh, so great was the difference between the two. And long after that, while eating his dinner, he snorted every time he thought of the dressing-gown. He felt very gay during his dinner, and afterwards he did no copying whatsoever. Instead, he wallowed in luxury for a while, lying on his bed until dark. Then, without further dallying, he dressed, pulled on his new overcoat, and went out. It is, alas, impossible to say just where the party-giving clerk lived. My memory is beginning to fail me badly, and everything in Petersburg, streets and houses, has become so mixed up in my head that it's very difficult to extract anything from it, and to present it in an orderly fashion. Be that as it may, it is a fact that the clerk in question lived in a better district of the city, which means not too close to Akaky Akakiyevich. To start with, Akaky Akakiyevich had to pass through a maze of deserted, dimly lit streets, but toward the clerk's house the streets became lighter and livelier. More pedestrians began flashing by more often. There were some well-dressed ladies and men with beaver collars, and instead of the drivers with their wooden fretworked sledges studded with gilt nails, he came across smart coachmen in crimson velvet caps, in lacquered sledges, with bearskin lap-rugs. He even saw some carriages darting past with decorated boxes, their wheels squeaking on the snow. Akaky Akakiyevich gazed around him. For several years now he hadn't been out in the evening. He stopped before the small lighted window of a shop, staring curiously at a picture of a pretty woman kicking off her shoe and thereby showing her whole leg, which was not bad at all. In the background, some man or other with side whiskers and a handsome Spanish goatee was sticking his head through a door leading to another room. Akaky Akakiyevich shook his head, snorted, smiled, and walked on. Why did he snort? Was it because he had come across something that, although completely strange to him, still aroused in him, as it would in anyone, a certain instinct? Or did he think, as many clerks do, along the following lines: well, really, the French, if they are after something, that sort of thing, then, really... Maybe he didn't even think that. After all, one can't just creep into a man's soul and find out everything he's thinking. At last he reached the house in which the head clerk's assistant lived, and he lived in style, on the second floor, with the staircase lighted by a lantern. In the hall, Akaky Akakiyevich found several rows of galoshes. Amidst the galoshes, a samovar was hissing and puffing steam. All around the walls hung overcoats and cloaks, some with beaver collars and others with velvet lapels. The noise and talk that could be heard through the partition became suddenly clear and resounding when the door opened, and a servant came out with a tray of empty glasses, a cream jug, and a basket of cookies. It was clear that the clerks had arrived long before and had already drunk their first round of tea. Akaky Akakiyevich hung his coat up and went in. In a flash he took in the candles, the clerks, the pipes, the card-tables, while his ears were filled with the hubbub of voices rising all around him, and the banging of chairs being moved. Awkwardly he paused in the middle of the room, trying to think what to do, but he had been noticed, and his arrival was greeted with a huge yell. Immediately everybody rushed out into the hall to have another look at his new overcoat. Akaky Akakiyevich felt a bit confused, but, being an uncomplicated man, he was rather pleased when everyone agreed that it was a good overcoat. Soon, however, they abandoned him and his overcoat, and turned their attention, as was to be expected, to the card-tables. The din, the voices, the presence of so many people, All this was unreal to Akaky Akakiyevich. He had no idea how to behave, where to put his hands, his feet, or, for that matter, his whole body. He sat down near a card table, stared at the cards, and peeked in turns into the faces of the players. In a little while he got bored and began to yawn, feeling rather sleepy. It was long past his usual bedtime. He wanted to take leave of the host, but they wouldn't let him go. He really had to toast his new overcoat with champagne, they insisted. They made Akaky Akakiyevich drink 2 glasses of champagne, after which he felt that the party was becoming gayer. But nevertheless he was quite unable to forget that it was now midnight, and that he should have gone home long ago. In spite of everything his host could think up to keep him, he went quietly out into the hall, found his overcoat, which to his annoyance was lying on the floor, shook it, carefully removed every speck he could find on it, put it on, and walked down the stairs and out into the street. The street was still lighted. Some little stores, those meeting places for servants and people of every sort, were open, while others, although closed, still showed a long streak of light under their doors, which indicated that the company had not yet dispersed, and that the manservants and maids were finishing up their gossip and their conversations, leaving their masters perplexed as to their whereabouts. Akaky Akakiyevich walked along in such a gay mood that, who knows why, he almost darted after a lady who flashed by him like a streak of lightning, every part of her body astir with independent, fascinating motion. Still he restrained himself immediately, went back to walking slowly, and even wondered where that compulsion to gallop had come from. Soon there stretched out before him those deserted streets which, even in the daytime, are not so gay, and now that it was night, looked even more desolate. Fewer street lamps were lit. Obviously, a smaller oil allowance was given out in this district. Then came wooden houses and fences, not a soul around, nothing but glistening snow and the black silhouettes of the low, sleeping hovels with their shuttered windows. He came to the spot where the street cut through a square so immense that the houses opposite were hardly visible beyond its sinister emptiness. God knows where, far away on the edges of the world, he could see the glow of a brazier by a watchman's hut. Akaky Akakiyevich's gay mood definitely waned. He could not suppress a shiver as he stepped out into the square, a foreboding of evil in his heart. He glanced behind him and to either side. It was like being in the middle of the sea. "No, it's better not to look," he thought, and walked on with his eyes shut. And when he opened them again to see if the other side of the square was close, he saw instead, standing there almost in front of his nose, people with moustaches, although he couldn't make out exactly who or what. Then his vision became foggy, and there was a beating in his chest. "Well, here's my overcoat," one of the people thundered, grabbing him by the collar. Akaky Akakiyevich was just going to shout out, "Help!" when another brought a fist about the size of the clerk's head up to his very mouth, and said, "You just try and yell." Akaky Akakiyevich felt them pull off his coat. Then he received a knee in the groin. He went down on his back, and after that he lay in the snow and felt nothing more. When he came to a few minutes later and scrambled to his feet, there was no one around. He felt cold, and when he realized that the overcoat was gone, desperate. He let out a yell, but his voice didn't come close to reaching the other side of the square. Frantic, he hollered all the way across the square as he scrambled straight toward the watchman's hut. The watchman was standing beside it, leaning on his halberd and gazing out across the square, wondering who it could be running toward him and shouting. At last Akaky Akakiyevich reached him. Gasping for breath, he began shouting at him. What sort of a watchman did he think he was? Hadn't he seen anything? Then why the devil had he allowed them to rob a man? The watchman said he had seen no one except the two men who had stopped Akaky Akakiyevich in the middle of the square, who he had thought were friends of his, and that, instead of hollering at the watchman, he'd better go and see the police inspector tomorrow, and the inspector would find out who had taken the overcoat. Akaky Akakiyevich hurried home. He was in a terrible state. The little hair he had left on his temples and on the back of his head was completely dishevelled. There was snow all down one side of him, and on his chest, and all over his trousers. His old landlady, hearing his impatient banging on the door, jumped out of bed, and, with only one shoe on, ran to open up, clutching her nightgown at the neck, probably out of modesty. When she saw the state Akaky Akakiyevich was in, she stepped back. When he told her what had happened, she threw up her hands and said that he should go straight to the borough police commissioner, that the local police inspector could not be trusted, that he'd just make promises and give him the runaround. So it was best, she said, to go straight to the borough commissioner. In fact, she even knew him because Anna, her former Finnish cook, had now got a job as a nanny at his house, and the landlady herself often saw him driving past their house. Moreover, she knew he went to church every Sunday and prayed, and at the same time looked cheerful, and was obviously a good man. Having heard her advice, Akaky Akakiyevich trudged off sadly to his room, and somehow got through the night, though exactly how must be imagined by those who know how to put themselves in another man's place. Early the next morning he went to the borough commissioner's, but it turned out that he was still asleep. He returned at 10, and again was told he was asleep. He went back at 11, and was told that the commissioner was not home. He tried again during the dinner hour, but the secretaries in the reception-room would not let him in, and wanted to know what business had brought him. For once in his life, Akaky Akakiyevich decided to show some character, and told them curtly that he must see the commissioner personally, that they'd better let him in, since he was on official government business, that he would lodge a complaint against them, and that then they would see. The secretaries didn't dare say anything to that, and one of them went to call the commissioner. The commissioner reacted very strangely to Akaky Akakiyevich's story of the robbery. Instead of concentrating on the main point, he asked Akaky Akakiyevich what he had been doing out so late, whether he had stopped off somewhere on his way, hadn't he been to a house of ill repute. Akaky Akakiyevich became very confused, and when he left, he wasn't sure whether something would be done about his overcoat or not. That day he did not go to his office for the first time in his life. The next day he appeared, looking very pale and wearing his old dressing-gown, which now seemed shabbier than ever. His account of the theft of his overcoat touched many of the clerks, although even now there were some who poked fun at him. They decided on the spot to take up a collection for him, but they collected next to nothing, because the department employees had already had to donate money for a portrait of the director, and to subscribe to some book or other, on the suggestion of the section chief, who was a friend of the author's. So the sum turned out to be the merest trifle. Someone, moved by compassion, decided to help Akaky Akakiyevich by giving him good advice. He told him that he had better not go to his local inspector, because, even supposing the inspector wanted to impress his superiors and managed to recover the coat, Akaky Akakiyevich would still find it difficult to obtain it at the police station unless he could present irrefutable proof of ownership. The best thing was to go through a certain important personage who, by writing and contacting the right people, would set things moving faster. So Akaky Akakiyevich decided to seek an audience with the important personage. Even to this day it is not known exactly what position the important personage held, or what his duties consisted of. All we need to know is that this important personage had become important quite recently, and that formerly he had been an unimportant person, and even his present position was unimportant compared with other more important ones. But there is always a category of people for whom somebody who is unimportant to others is an important personage, and the personage in question used various devices to play up his importance. For instance, he made the civil servants of lower categories come out to meet him on the stairs before he'd even reached his office, and a subordinate could not approach him directly, but had to go through proper channels. That's the way things are in Holy Russia. Everyone tries to ape his superior. They say that one ninth-class clerk, when he was named section chief in a small office, immediately had a partition put up to make a separate room, which he called the conference room. He stationed an usher at the door who had to open it for all those who came in, although the conference room had hardly enough space for a writing table, even without visitors. The audiences and the manner of our important personage were impressive and stately, but quite uncomplicated. The key to his system was severity. He liked to say, "Severity, severity, severity," and as he uttered the word for the third time, he usually looked very meaningfully into the face of the person he was talking to. True, it was not too clear what need there was for all this severity, since the 10-odd employees who made up the whole administrative apparatus of his office were quite frightened enough as it was. Seeing him coming, they would leave their work and stand to attention until he had crossed the room. His usual communication with his inferiors was full of severity, and consisted almost entirely of 3 phrases. "How dare you?" "Who do you think you're talking to?" and "Do you appreciate who I am?" Actually, he was a kindly man, a good friend and obliging, but promotion to a high rank had gone to his head, knocked him completely off balance, and he just didn't know how to act. When he happened to be with equals, he was still a decent fellow, and, in a way, by no means stupid. But whenever he found himself among those who were below him, even a single rank, he became impossible. He fell silent and was quite pitiable, because even he himself realized that he could have been having a much better time. Sometimes he was obviously longing to join some group in a lively conversation, but he would be stopped by the thought that he would be going too far, putting himself on familiar terms, and thereby losing face. And so he remained eternally in silent, aloof isolation, only occasionally uttering some monosyllabic sounds, and as a result he acquired a reputation as a deadly bore. It was to this important personage that Akaky Akakiyevich presented himself, and at a most unpropitious moment to boot. That is, very unpropitious for him, although quite suitable for the important personage. The latter was in his office, talking gaily to a childhood friend who had recently come to Petersburg, and whom he hadn't seen for many years. This was the moment when they announced that there was a man named Shunik to see him. "Who's he?" the personage wanted to know. "Some clerk," they told him. "I see. Let him wait. I am not available now." Here it should be noted that the important personage was greatly exaggerating. He was available. He and his friend had talked over everything imaginable. For some time now the conversation had been interlaced with lengthy silences, and they weren't doing much more than slapping each other on the thigh and saying, "Say, that's how it is, Ivan Abramovich." "Yes, indeed, Stepan Varlamovich." Still, Akaky Akakiyevich had to wait, so that his friend, who had left the government service long ago and now lived in the country, could see what a long time employees had to wait in his reception-room. At last, when they had talked and had sat silent facing each other for as long as they could stand it, when they had smoked a cigar, reclining in comfortable armchairs with sloping backs, the important personage, as if he had just recalled it, said to his secretary, who was standing at the door with papers for a report, "Wait a minute. Wasn't there a clerk waiting? Tell him to come in." Seeing Akaky Akakiyevich's humble appearance and his wretched old frock-coat, he turned abruptly to face him and said, "What do you want?" He spoke in the hard, sharp voice which he had deliberately developed by practising at home before a mirror an entire week before he had taken over his present exalted position. Akaky Akakiyevich, who had felt properly subdued even before this, felt decidedly embarrassed. He did his best, as far as he could control his tongue, to explain what had happened. Of course, he added even more than his usual share of phrases like, "that is to say," and "so to speak." The overcoat, he explained, was completely new, and had been cruelly taken away from him, and he had turned to the important personage, that is to say, come to him, in the hope that he would, so to speak, intercede for him somehow, that is to say, write to the superintendent of police, or, so to speak, to someone, and find the overcoat. For some unimaginable reason, the important personage found his manner too familiar. "My dear sir," he answered sharply, "don't you know the proper channels? Do you realize whom you're addressing, and what the proper procedure should be? You should first have handed in a petition to the office. It would have gone to the head clerk. From him it would have reached the section head, who would have approached my secretary, and only then would the secretary have presented it to me." "But, Your Excellency," said Akaky Akakiyevich, trying to gather what little composure he had, and feeling at the same time that he was sweating terribly, "Your Excellency, I ventured to trouble you because secretaries, that is to say, are, so to speak, an unreliable lot." What? Demanded the important personage. "Where did you pick up such an attitude? Where did you get such ideas? What is this insubordination that is spreading among young people against their chiefs and superiors?" The important personage apparently had not noticed that Akaky Akakiyevich was well over 50. Thus, surely, if he could be called young at all, it would only be relatively, that is, to someone of 70. "Do you realize to whom you're talking? Do you appreciate who I am? Do you realize, do you? I'm asking you." Here he stamped his foot and raised his voice to such a pitch that there was no need to be an Akaky Akakiyevich to be frightened, and Akaky Akakiyevich froze completely. He staggered, his whole body shook, and he was quite unable to keep his feet. If a messenger hadn't rushed over and supported him, he would have collapsed onto the floor. They carried him out almost unconscious, and the important personage, pleased to see that his dramatic effect had exceeded his expectations, and completely delighted with the idea that a word from him could knock a man unconscious, glanced at his friend to see what he thought of it all, and was pleased to see the friend looked somewhat at a loss, and that fear had extended to him too. Akaky Akakiyevich remembered nothing about getting downstairs and out into the street. He could feel neither hand nor foot. In all his life he had never been so severely reprimanded by a high official, and not a direct chief of his at that. He walked open-mouthed through a blizzard, again and again stumbling off the sidewalk. The wind, according to Petersburg custom, blew at him from all four sides at once, out of every side street. In no time it had blown him a sore throat, and he got himself home at last, quite unable to say a word. His throat was swollen, and he went straight to bed. That's how severe the effects of an adequate reprimand can be. The next day he was found to have a high fever. Thanks to the generous assistance of the Petersburg climate, the illness progressed beyond all expectations. A doctor came, felt his pulse, found there was nothing he could do, and prescribed a poultice. That was done so that the patient would not be deprived of the beneficial aid of medicine. The doctor added, however, that, by the way, the patient had another day and a half to go, after which he would be what is called kaput. Then, turning to the landlady, the doctor said, "And you, my good woman,
I'd not waste my time if I were you. I'd order him the coffin right away. A pine one. The oak ones, I imagine, would be too expensive for him."
Whether Akaky Akakiyevich heard what for him were fateful words, and if he heard, whether they had a shattering effect on him, and whether he was sorry to lose his wretched life, are matters of conjecture. He was feverish and delirious the whole time. Apparitions, each stranger than the last, kept crowding before him. He saw Petrovitch and ordered an overcoat containing some sort of concealed traps to catch the thieves who were hiding under his bed, so that every minute he kept calling his landlady to come and pull out the one who had even slipped under his blanket. Next he would ask why his old dressing-gown was hanging there in front of him when he had a new overcoat. Then he would find himself standing before the important personage, listening to the reprimand, and repeating over and over,
"I am sorry, Your Excellency. I am sorry."
Then he began to swear, using the most frightful words, which caused his old landlady to cross herself in horror. Never in her life had she heard anything like it from him, and what made it even worse was that they came pouring out on the heels of the phrase,
"Your Excellency."
After that he talked complete nonsense, and it was impossible to make out anything he was saying, except that his disconnected words kept groping for that lost overcoat of his. Then, at last, poor Akaky Akakiyevich gave up the ghost. They did not bother to seal his room or his belongings, because there were no heirs, and moreover very little to inherit, namely a bundle of goose quills, a quire of white government paper, 3 pairs of socks, a few buttons that had come off his trousers, and the old dressing-gown coat already mentioned. God knows whom they went to. Even the reporter of this story did not care enough to find out. They took Akaky Akakiyevich away and buried him, and Petersburg went on without him exactly as if he had never existed. A creature had vanished, disappeared. He had had no one to protect him. No one had ever paid him the slightest attention, not even that which a naturalist pays to a common fly which he mounts on a pin and looks at through his microscope. True, this creature, who had meekly borne the office jokes and gone quietly to his grave, had, toward the end of his life, a cherished visitor, the overcoat, which for a brief moment had brightened his wretched existence. Then a crushing blow had finished everything, a blow such as befalls the powerful of the earth. A few days after his death, a messenger from his office was sent to his lodgings with an order summoning him to report immediately. The chief was asking for him, but the messenger had to return alone, and to report that Akaky Akakiyevich could not come. "Why not?" he was asked.
"Because," the messenger said, "he died. They buried him 4 days ago."
That is how the department found out about Akaky Akakiyevich's death. The next day a new clerk sat in his place. He was much taller, and his handwriting was not as straight. In fact, his letters slanted considerably. But who would have imagined that this was not the end of Akaky Akakiyevich, and that he was fated to live on and make his presence felt for a few days after his death, as if in compensation for having spent his life unnoticed by anyone? But that's the way it happened, and our little story gains an unexpectedly fantastic ending. Rumors suddenly started to fly around Petersburg that a ghost was haunting the streets at night in the vicinity of the Kalinkin Bridge. The ghost, which looked like a little clerk, was purportedly searching for a stolen overcoat, and used this pretext to pull the coats off the shoulders of everyone he met without regard for rank or title. And it made no difference what kind of coat it was. Cat, beaver, fox, bearskin, in fact, any of the furs and skins people have thought up to cover their own skins with. One of the department employees saw the ghost with his own eyes, and instantly recognized Akaky Akakiyevich. However, he was so terrified that he dashed off as fast as his legs would carry him, and so didn't get a good look. He only saw from a distance that the ghost was shaking his finger at him. Complaints kept pouring in, and not only from petty employees, which would have been understandable. One and all, even privy councillors, were catching chills in their backs and shoulders from having their overcoats peeled off. The police were ordered to catch the ghost at any cost, dead or alive, and to punish him with due severity as a warning to others. And what's more, they nearly succeeded. To be precise, a watchman caught the ghost red-handed, grabbed it by the collar in Koryushkin Alley as it was trying to pull the coat off a retired musician who, in his day, used to tootle on the flute. Grabbing it, he called for help from 2 colleagues of his and asked them to hold on to it for just a minute. He had, he said, to get his snuff-box out of his boot so that he could bring some feeling back to his nose, which had been frostbitten 6 times in his life. But it was evidently snuff that even a ghost couldn't stand. The man, closing his right nostril with his finger, had hardly sniffed up half a fistful into the left when the ghost sneezed so violently that the 3 watchmen were blinded by the resulting shower. They all raised their fists to wipe their eyes, and when they could see again, the ghost had vanished. They even wondered whether they had really held him at all. After that, watchmen were so afraid of the ghost that they felt reluctant to interfere with live robbers, and contented themselves with shouting from a distance, "Hey, you! On your way!" And the clerk's ghost began to haunt the streets well beyond the Kalinkin Bridge, spreading terror among the meek. However, we have completely neglected the important personage, who really, in a sense, was the cause of the fantastic direction that this story, which, by the way, is completely true, has taken. First of all, it is only fair to say that shortly after poor Akaky Akakiyevich, reduced to a pulp, had left his office, the important personage felt a twinge of regret. Compassion was not foreign to him. Many good impulses stirred his heart, although his position usually prevented them from coming to the surface. As soon as his visiting friend had left the office, his thoughts returned to Akaky Akakiyevich, and after that, almost every day, he saw in his mind's eye the bloodless face of the little clerk who had been unable to take a proper reprimand. This thought was so disturbing that a week later he went so far as to send a clerk from his office to see how Akaky Akakiyevich was doing, and to find out whether, in fact, there was any way to help him. And when he heard the news that Akaky Akakiyevich had died suddenly of a fever, it was almost a blow to him, even made him feel guilty, and spoiled his mood for the whole day. Trying to rid himself of these thoughts, to forget the whole unpleasant business, he went to a party at a friend's house. There he found himself in respectable company, and, what's more, among people nearly all of whom were of the same standing, so that there was absolutely nothing to oppress him. A great change came over him. He let himself go, chatted pleasantly, was amiable, in a word, spent a very pleasant evening. At supper he drank a couple of glasses of champagne, a well-recommended prescription for inducing good spirits. The champagne gave him an inclination for something special, and so he decided not to go home, but instead to pay a little visit to a certain well-known lady named Karolina Ivanovna, a lady, it seems, of German extraction, toward whom he felt very friendly. It should be said that the important personage was no longer a young man, and that he was a good husband, the respected father of a family. His 2 sons, one of whom already had a civil service post, and his sweet-faced 16-year-old daughter, who had a slightly hooked but nevertheless pretty little nose, greeted him every day with a
"Bonjour, papa."
His wife, a youngish woman, and not unattractive at that, gave him her hand to kiss, and then kissed his. But although the important personage was quite content with these displays of family affection, he considered it the proper thing to do to have, for friendship's sake, a lady friend in another part of the city. This lady friend was not a bit prettier or younger than his wife, but the world is full of such puzzling things, and it is not our business to judge them. So the important personage came down the steps, stepped into his sledge, and said to the coachman, "To Karolina Ivanovna's." Wrapping his warm, luxurious fur coat around him, he sat back in his seat. He was in that state so cherished by Russians, in which, without your having to make any effort, thoughts, each one pleasanter than the last, slipped into your head by themselves. Perfectly content, he went over all the most pleasant moments at the party, over the clever retorts that had caused that select gathering to laugh. He even repeated many of them under his breath, and, still finding them funny, laughed heartily at them all over again, which was natural enough. However, he kept being bothered by gusts of wind, which would suddenly blow, God knows from where, or for what reason, cutting his face, throwing lumps of snow into it, filling the cape of his coat like a sail, and throwing it over his head, so that he had to extricate himself from it again and again. Suddenly the important personage felt someone grab him violently from behind. He turned around and saw a small man in a worn-out frock coat. Terrified, he recognized Akaky Akakevich, his face as white as the snow, and looking altogether very ghostly indeed. Fear took over completely when the important personage saw the ghost's mouth twist, and, sending a whiff of the grave into his face, uttered the following words, "I've caught you at last. I've got you by the collar now. It's the coat I need. You did nothing about mine, and hollered at me to boot. Now I'll take yours." The poor important personage almost died. He may have displayed force of character in the office, and in general toward his inferiors, so that after one glance at his strong face and manly figure, people would say, "Quite a man." But now, like many other mighty-looking people, he was so frightened that he began to think, not without reason, that he was about to have an attack of something or other. He was even very helpful in peeling off his coat, after which he shouted to the coachman in a ferocious tone, "Home! As fast as you can!" The coachman, hearing the ferocious tone which the important personage used in critical moments, and which was sometimes accompanied with something even more drastic, instinctively ducked his head and cracked his whip, so that they tore away like a streak. In a little over 6 minutes the important personage was in front of his house. Instead of being at Karolina Ivanovna's, he was somehow staggering to his room, pale, terrified, and coatless. There he spent such a restless night that the next morning, at breakfast, his daughter said,
"You look terribly pale this morning, Papa."
But Papa was silent, and he didn't say a word to anyone about what had happened to him, or where he had been, or where he had intended to go. This incident made a deep impression upon him. From then on his subordinates heard far less often, "How dare you?" and "Do you know whom you're talking to?" And even when he did use these expressions, it was after listening to what others had to say. But even more remarkable, after that night, Akaky Akakevich's ghost was never seen again. The important personage's overcoat must have fitted him snugly. At any rate, one no longer heard of coats being torn from people's shoulders. However, many busybodies wouldn't let the matter rest there, and maintained that the ghost was still haunting certain distant parts of the city. And sure enough, a watchman in the Kolomna district caught a glimpse of the ghost behind a house. But he was rather a frail watchman. Once an ordinary but mature piglet, rushing out of a private house, knocked him off his feet, to the huge delight of a bunch of cabbies, whom he fined 2 kopecks each for their lack of respect. Then he spent the proceeds on tobacco. So, being rather frail, the watchman didn't dare to arrest the ghost. Instead, he followed it in the darkness until at last it stopped suddenly, turned to face him, and asked, "You looking for trouble?" And it shook a huge fist at him, much larger than any you'll find among the living. "No," the watchman said, turning away. This ghost, however, was a much taller one, and wore an enormous moustache. It walked off, it seems, in the direction of the Overcoat bridge, and soon dissolved into the gloom of night.
I am a businessman. I am a methodical man. Method is the thing, after all. But there are no people I more heartily despise than your eccentric fools who prate about method without understanding it, attending strictly to its letter, and violating its spirit. These fellows are always doing the most out-of-the-way things in what they call an orderly manner. Now here, I conceive, is a positive paradox. True method appertains to the ordinary and the obvious alone, and cannot be applied to the outre. What definite idea can a body attach to such expressions as methodical jack-a-dandy, or a systematical will-o'-the-wisp? My notions upon this head might not have been so clear as they are, but for a fortunate accident which happened to me when I was a very little boy. A good-hearted old Irish nurse, whom I shall not forget in my will, took me up one day by the heels, when I was making more noise than was necessary, and swinging me round 2 or 3 times, damned my eyes for a shrieking little spalpeen, and then knocked my head into a cocked hat against the bedpost. This, I say, decided my fate, and made my fortune. A bump arose at once on my sinciput, and turned out to be as pretty an organ of order as one shall see on a summer's day. Hence that positive appetite for system and regularity which has made me the distinguished man of business that I am. If there is anything on earth I hate, it is a genius. Your geniuses are all arrant asses. The greater the genius, the greater the ass. And to this rule there is no exception whatever. Especially you cannot make a man of business out of a genius, any more than money out of a Jew, or the best nutmegs out of pine nuts. The creatures are always going off at a tangent into some fantastic employment, or ridiculous speculation, entirely at variance with the fitness of things, and having no business whatever to be considered as a business at all. Thus you may tell these characters immediately by the nature of their occupations. If you ever perceive a man setting up as a merchant or a manufacturer, or going into the cotton or tobacco trade, or any of those eccentric pursuits, or getting to be a dry goods dealer, or soap boiler, or something of that kind, or pretending to be a lawyer or a blacksmith, anything out of the usual way, you may set him down at once as a genius, and then, according to the rule of 3, he's an ass. Now, I am not in any respect a genius, but a regular business-man. My day-book and ledger will evince this in a minute. They are well kept, though I say it myself, and in my general habits of accuracy and punctuality I am not to be beat by a clock. Moreover, my occupations have been always made to chime in with the ordinary habitudes of my fellow men. Not that I feel the least indebted upon this score to my exceedingly weak-minded parents, who beyond doubt would have made an arrant genius of me at last, if my guardian angel had not come in good time to the rescue. In biography the truth is everything, and in autobiography it is especially so. Yet I scarcely hope to be believed when I state, however solemnly, that my poor father put me, when I was about 15 years of age, into the counting-house of what he termed a respectable hardware and commission merchant doing a capital bit of business. A capital bit of fiddlestick. However, the consequence of this folly was that in 2 or 3 days I had to be sent home to my button-headed family in a high state of fever, and with a most violent and dangerous pain in the sinciput, all round about my organ of order. It was nearly a gone case with me then, just touch and go for 6 weeks, the physicians giving me up and all that sort of thing. But although I suffered much, I was a thankful boy in the main. I was saved from being a respectable hardware and commission merchant doing a capital bit of business, and I felt grateful to the protuberance which had been the means of my salvation, as well as to the kind-hearted female who had originally put these means within my reach. The most of boys run away from home at 10 or 12 years of age, but I waited till I was 16. I don't know that I should have gone even then, if I had not happened to hear my old mother talk about setting me up on my own hook in the grocery way. The grocery way! Only think of that! I resolved to be off forthwith, and try and establish myself in some decent occupation without dancing attendance any longer upon the caprices of these eccentric old people, and running the risk of being made a genius of in the end. In this project I succeeded perfectly well at the first effort, and by the time I was fairly 18 found myself doing an extensive and profitable business in the tailor's walking advertisement line. I was enabled to discharge the onerous duties of this profession only by that rigid adherence to system which formed the leading feature of my mind. A scrupulous method characterized my actions as well as my accounts. In my case it was method, not money, which made the man, at least all of him that was not made by the tailor whom I served. At 9 every morning I called upon that individual for the clothes of the day. 10 o'clock found me in some fashionable promenade or other place of public amusement. The precise regularity with which I turned my handsome person about, so as to bring successively into view every portion of the suit upon my back, was the admiration of all the knowing men in the trade. Noon never passed without my bringing home a customer to the house of my employers, Messrs. Cut and Come Again. I say this proudly, but with tears in my eyes, for the firm proved themselves the basest of ingrates. The little account about which we quarrelled and finally parted cannot in any item be thought overcharged by gentlemen really conversant with the nature of the business. Upon this point, however, I feel a degree of proud satisfaction in permitting the reader to judge for himself. My bill ran thus: Messrs. Cut and Come Again, Merchant Tailors, to Peter Profit, Walking Advertiser. Debtors. July 10. To promenade as usual, and customer brought home 25 cents. July 11. To ditto, 25 cents. July 12, to one lie, second class, damaged black cloth sold for invisible green, 25 cents. July 13, to one lie, first class, extra quality and size, recommending milled satinette as broadcloth, 75 cents. July 20th, to purchasing brand-new paper shirt collar or dicky to set off grey Petersham, 2 cents. August 15th, to wearing double-padded bobtail frock, thermometer 706 in the shade, 25 cents. August 16th, standing on one leg 3 hours to show off new style strapped pants at 12.5 cents per leg per hour, 37.5 cents. August 17th, to promenade as usual and large customer brought, fat man, 50 cents. August 18th, to ditto, medium size, 25 cents. August 19th, to ditto, small man and bad pay, 6 cents. Total $2.95.5. The item chiefly disputed in this bill was the very moderate charge of 2 pennies for the dicky. Upon my word of honour, this was not an unreasonable price for that dicky. It was one of the cleanest and prettiest little dickies I ever saw, and I have good reason to believe that it effected the sale of the 3 Petershams. The elder partner of the firm, however, would allow me only 1 penny of the charge, and took it upon himself to show in what manner 4 of the same sized conveniences could be got out of a sheet of foolscap. But it is needless to say that I stood upon the principle of the thing. Business is business, and should be done in a business way. There was no system whatever in swindling me out of a penny, a clear fraud of 50%, no method in any respect. I left at once the employment of Messrs. Cut and Come Again, and set up in the eyesore line by myself, one of the most lucrative, respectable, and independent of the ordinary occupations. My strict integrity, economy, and rigorous business habits here again came into play. I found myself driving a flourishing trade, and soon became a marked man upon change. The truth is, I never dabbled in flashy matters, but jogged on in the good old sober routine of a calling in which I should no doubt have remained to the present hour, but for a little accident which happened to me in the prosecution of one of the usual business operations of the profession. Whenever a rich old hunks or prodigal heir or bankrupt corporation gets into the notion of putting up a palace, there is no such thing in the world as stopping either of them. And this every intelligent person knows. The fact in question is indeed the basis of the eyesore trade. As soon, therefore, as a building project is fairly afoot by one of these parties, we merchants secure a nice corner of the lot in contemplation, or a prime little situation just adjoining or right in front. This done, we wait until the palace is halfway up, and then we pay some tasty architect to run us up an ornamental mud hovel right against it, or a down east, or Dutch pagoda, or a pigsty, or an ingenious little bit of fancy work, either Eskimo, Kickapoo, or Hottentot. Of course, we can't afford to take these structures down under a bonus of 500% upon the prime cost of our lot and plaster. Can we? I ask the question. I ask it of businessmen. It would be irrational to suppose that we can. And yet there was a rascally corporation which asked me to do this very thing. I did not reply to their absurd proposition, of course, but I felt it a duty to go that same night and lamp-black the whole of their palace. For this the unreasonable villains clapped me into jail, and the gentlemen of the eyesore trade could not well avoid cutting my connection when I came out. The assault and battery business into which I was now forced to adventure for a livelihood was somewhat ill-adapted to the delicate nature of my constitution, but I went to work in it with a good heart, and found my account here, as heretofore, in those stern habits of methodical accuracy which had been thumped into me by that delightful old nurse. I would indeed be the basest of men not to remember her well in my will. By observing, as I say, the strictest system in all my dealings, and keeping a well-regulated set of books, I was enabled to get over many serious difficulties, and in the end to establish myself very decently in the profession. The truth is that few individuals in any line did a snugger little business than I. I will just copy a page or so out of my day-book, and this will save me the necessity of blowing my own trumpet, a contemptible practice of which no high-minded man will be guilty. Now, the day-book is the thing that don't lie. January 1, New Year's Day. Met Snap in the street, groggy. Memorandum. He'll do. Met Gruff shortly afterward, blind drunk. Memorandum, he'll answer, too. Entered both gentlemen in my ledger, and opened a running account with each. January 2. Saw Snap at the exchange, and went up and trod on his toe. Doubled his fist and knocked me down. Good. Got up again. Some trifling difficulty with Bagg, my attorney. I wanted the damages at 1,000, but he says that for so simple a knockdown we can't lay them at more than 500. Memorandum. Must get rid of Bagg. No system at all. January 3. Went to the theatre to look for Gruff. Saw him sitting in a side-box in the second tier between a fat lady and a lean one. Quizzed the whole party through an opera-glass till I saw the fat lady blush and whisper to G. Went round then into the box and put my nose within reach of his hand. Wouldn't pull it. No go. Blew it and tried again. No go. Sat down then and winked at the lean lady, when I had the high satisfaction of finding him lift me up by the nape of the neck and fling me over into the pit. Neck dislocated and right leg capitally splintered. Went home in high glee, drank a bottle of champagne, and booked the young man for 5,000. Bagg says it'll do. February 15. Compromised the case of Mr. Snap. Amount entered in journal, 50 cents, which see. February 16. Cast by that ruffian Gruff, who made me a present of $5. Costs of suit $4.25. Net profit, see journal, 75 cents. Now here is a clear gain in a very brief period of no less than $1.25. This is in the mere cases of snap and gruff, and I solemnly assure the reader that these extracts are taken at random from my day-book. It's an old saying, and a true one, however, that money is nothing in comparison with health. I found the exactions of the profession somewhat too much for my delicate state of body, and discovering at last that I was knocked all out of shape, so that I didn't know very well what to make of the matter, and so that my friends, when they met me in the street, couldn't tell that I was Peter Prophet at all, it occurred to me that the best expedient I could adopt was to alter my line of business. I turned my attention, therefore, to mud-dabbling, and continued it for some years. The worst of this occupation is that too many people take a fancy to it, and the competition is in consequence excessive. Every ignoramus of a fellow who finds that he hasn't brains in sufficient quantity to make his way as a working advertiser, or an eyesore prig, or a salt and batter man, thinks, of course, that he'll answer very well as a dabbler of mud. But there never was entertained a more erroneous idea than that it requires no brains to mud-dabble. Especially, there is nothing to be made in this way without method. I did only a retail business myself, but my old habits of system carried me swimmingly along. I selected my street crossing in the first place with great deliberation, and I never put down a broom in any part of the town but that. I took care, too, to have a nice little puddle at hand, which I could get at in a minute. By these means I got to be well known as a man to be trusted. And this is one half of the battle, let me tell you, in trade. Nobody ever failed to pitch me a copper, and got over my crossing with a clean pair of pantaloons. And as my business habits in this respect were sufficiently understood, I never met with any attempt at imposition. I wouldn't have put up with it if I had. Never imposing upon anyone myself, I suffered no one to play the possum with me. The frauds of the banks, of course, I couldn't help. Their suspension put me to ruinous inconvenience. These, however, are not individuals, but corporations, and corporations, it is very well known, have neither bodies to be kicked nor souls to be damned. I was making money at this business when, in an evil moment, I was induced to merge in the curse-spattering, a somewhat analogous, but by no means so respectable a profession. My location, to be sure, was an excellent one, being central, and I had capital blacking and brushes. My little dog, too, was quite fat, and up to all varieties of snuff. He had been in the trade a long time, and I may say understood it. Our general routine was this. Pompey, having rolled himself well in the mud, sat upon end at the shop door, until he observed a dandy approaching in bright boots. He then proceeded to meet him, and gave the Wellingtons a rub or two with his wool. Then the dandy swore very much, and looked about for a bootblack. There I was, full in his view, with blacking and brushes. It was only a minute's work, and then came a sixpence. This did moderately well for a time. In fact, I was not avaricious, but my dog was. I allowed him a third of the profit, but he was advised to insist upon half. This I couldn't stand, so we quarrelled and parted. I next tried my hand at the organ grinding for a while, and may say that I made out pretty well. It is a plain, straightforward business, and requires no particular abilities. You can get a music mill for a mere song, and to put it in order you have but to open the works and give them 3 or 4 smart raps with a hammer. It improves the tone of the thing for business purposes more than you can imagine. This done, you have only to stroll along with a mill on your back until you see tanbark in the street and a knocker wrapped up in buckskin. Then you stop and grind, looking as if you meant to stop and grind till doomsday. Presently a window opens, and somebody pitches you a sixpence with a request to hush up and go on, etc. I am aware that some grinders have actually afforded to go on for this sum, but for my part I found the necessary outlay of capital too great to permit of my going on under a shilling. At this occupation I did a good deal, but somehow I was not quite satisfied, and so finally abandoned it. The truth is, I laboured under the disadvantage of having no monkey, and American streets are so muddy, and a democratic rabble is so obtrusive, and so full of demnition mischievous little boys. I was now out of employment for some months, but at length succeeded, by dint of great interest, in procuring a situation in the sham post. The duties here are simple and not altogether unprofitable. For example, very early in the morning I had to make up my packet of sham letters. Upon the inside of each of these I had to scrawl a few lines on any subject which occurred to me as sufficiently mysterious, signing all the epistles Tom Dobson or Bobby Tompkins, or anything in that way. Having folded and sealed all, and stamped them with sham postmarks, New Orleans, Bengal, Botany Bay, or any other place a great way off, I set out forthwith upon my daily route as if in a very great hurry. I always called at the big houses to deliver the letters and receive the postage. Nobody hesitates at paying for a letter, especially for a double one. People are such fools, and it was no trouble to get round a corner before there was time to open the epistles. The worst of this profession was that I had to walk so much and so fast, and so frequently to vary my route. Besides, I had serious scruples of conscience. I can't bear to hear innocent individuals abused, and the way the whole town took to cursing Tom Dobson and Bobby Tompkins was really awful to hear. I washed my hands of the matter in disgust. My 8th and last speculation has been in the cat-growing way. I have found this a most pleasant and lucrative business, and really no trouble at all. The country, it is well known, has become infested with cats, so much so of late that a petition for relief, mostly numerously and respectably signed, was brought before the legislature at its late memorable session. The Assembly at this epoch was unusually well informed, and having passed many other wise and wholesome enactments, it crowned all with the Cat Act. In its original form this law offered a premium for cat heads, 4d. apiece, but the Senate succeeded in amending the main clause so as to substitute the word tails for heads. This amendment was so obviously proper that the House concurred in it, nem con. As soon as the governor had signed the bill, I invested my whole estate in the purchase of Toms and Tabbies. At first I could only afford to feed them upon mice, which are cheap. But they fulfilled the scriptural injunction at so marvellous a rate that I at length considered it my best policy to be liberal, and so indulged them in oysters and turtle. Their tails at a legislative price now bring me in a good income, for I have discovered a way in which by means of Macassar oil I can force 3 crops in a year. It delights me to find, too, that the animals soon get accustomed to the thing, and would rather have the appendages cut off than otherwise. I consider myself, therefore, a made man, and am bargaining for a country seat on the Hudson.
The Devil in the Belfry. Everybody knows, in a general way, that the finest place in the world is, or alas was, the Dutch borough of Vondervathymittis. Yet as it lies some distance from any of the main roads, being in a somewhat out-of-the-way situation, there are perhaps very few of my readers who have ever paid it a visit. For the benefit of those who have not, therefore, it will be only proper that I should enter into some account of it. And this is indeed the more necessary, as with the hope of enlisting public sympathy in behalf of the inhabitants, I design here to give a history of the calamitous events which have so lately occurred within its limits. No one who knows me will doubt that the duty thus self-imposed will be executed to the best of my ability, with all that rigid impartiality, all that cautious examination into facts, and diligent collation of authorities, which should ever distinguish him who aspires to the title of historian. By the united aid of medals, manuscripts, and inscriptions, I am enabled to say positively that the borough of Vondervathymittis has existed, from its origin, in precisely the same condition which it at present preserves. On the date of this origin, however, I grieve that I can only speak with that species of indefinite definiteness which mathematicians are at times forced to put up with in certain algebraic formulae. The date, I may thus say, in regard to the remoteness of its antiquity, cannot be less than any assignable quantity whatsoever. Notwithstanding the obscurity which thus envelops the date of the foundation of Fondvatimitis and the derivation of its name, there can be no doubt, as I said before, that it has always existed as we find it at this epoch. The oldest man in the borough can remember not the slightest difference in the appearance of any portion of it, and, indeed, the very suggestion of such a possibility is considered an insult. The site of the village is in a perfectly circular valley, about 1/4 of a mile in circumference, and entirely surrounded by gentle hills, over whose summit the people have never yet ventured to pass. For this they assign the very good reason that they do not believe there is anything at all on the other side. Round the skirts of the valley, which is quite level and paved throughout with flat tiles, extends a continuous row of 60 little houses. These, having their backs on the hills, must look, of course, to the centre of the plain, which is just 60 yards from the front door of each dwelling. Every house has a small garden before it, with a circular path, a sundial, and 24 cabbages. The buildings themselves are so precisely alike that one can in no manner be distinguished from the other. Owing to the vast antiquity, the style of architecture is somewhat odd, but it is not for that reason the less strikingly picturesque. They are fashioned of hard-burned little bricks, red with black ends, so that the walls look like a chessboard upon a great scale. The gables are turned to the front, and there are cornices, as big as all the rest of the house, over the eaves and over the main doors. The windows are narrow and deep, with very tiny panes, and a great deal of sash. On the roof is a vast quantity of tiles with long curly ears. The woodwork throughout is of a dark hue, and there is much carving about it, with but a trifling variety of pattern, for, time out of mind, the carvers of Fondvatimitis have never been able to carve more than 2 objects, a timepiece and a cabbage. But these they do exceedingly well, and intersperse them with singular ingenuity wherever they find room for the chisel. The dwellings are as much alike inside as out, and the furniture is all upon one plan. The floors are of square tiles, the chairs and tables of black-looking wood with thin crooked legs and puppy feet. The mantelpieces are wide and high, and have not only timepieces and cabbages sculpted over the front, but a real timepiece, which makes a prodigious ticking on the top in the middle, with a flower-pot containing a cabbage standing on each extremity by way of outrider. Between each cabbage and the timepiece, again, is a little china man having a large stomach with a great round hole in it, through which is seen the dial-plate of a watch. The fireplaces are large and deep, with fierce, crooked-looking fire-dogs. There is constantly a rousing fire, and a huge pot over it, full of sauerkraut and pork, to which the good woman of the house is always busy in attending. She is a little fat old lady, with blue eyes and a red face, and wears a huge cap like a sugar-loaf, ornamented with purple and yellow ribbons. Her dress is of orange-coloured linsey-woolsey, made very full behind and very short in the waist, and indeed very short in other respects, not reaching below the middle of her leg. This is somewhat thick, and so are her ankles, but she has a fine pair of green stockings to cover them. Her shoes, of pink leather, are fastened each with a bunch of yellow ribbons puckered up in the shape of a cabbage. In her left hand she has a little heavy Dutch watch. In her right she wields a ladle for the sauerkraut and pork. By her side there stands a fat tabby cat, with a gilt toy repeater tied to its tail, which the boys have there fastened by way of a quiz. The boys themselves are, all 3 of them, in the garden attending the pig. They are each 2 feet in height. They have 3-cornered cocked hats, purple waistcoats reaching down to their thighs, buckskin knee-breeches, red stockings, heavy shoes with big silver buckles, long surtout coats with large buttons of mother-of-pearl. Each, too, has a pipe in his mouth, and a little dumpy watch in his right hand. He takes a puff and a look, and then a look and a puff. The pig, which is corpulent and lazy, is occupied now in picking up the stray leaves that fall from the cabbages, and now in giving a kick behind at the gilt repeater, which the urchins have also tied to his tail in order to make him look as handsome as the cat. Right at the front door, in a high-backed leather-bottomed armchair with crooked legs and puppy feet like the tables, is seated the old man of the house himself. He is an exceedingly puffy little old gentleman, with big circular eyes and a huge double chin. His dress resembles that of the boys, and I need say nothing farther about it. All the difference is that his pipe is somewhat bigger than theirs, and he can make a greater smoke. Like them, he has a watch, but he carries his watch in his pocket. To say the truth, he has something of more importance than a watch to attend to, and what that is I shall presently explain. He sits with his right leg upon his left knee, wears a grave countenance, and always keeps one of his eyes, at least, resolutely bent upon a certain remarkable object in the centre of the plain. This object is situated in the steeple of the house of the town council. The town council are all very little, round, oily, intelligent men, with big saucer eyes and fat double chins, and have their coats much longer, and their shoe buckles much bigger than the ordinary inhabitants of Fundafatimitis. Since my sojourn in the borough, they have had several special meetings, and have adopted these 3 important resolutions: that it is wrong to alter the good old course of things, that there is nothing tolerable out of Fundafatimitis, and that we will stick by our clocks and our cabbages. Above the session-room of the council is the steeple, and in the steeple is the belfry, where exists, and has existed time out of mind, the pride and wonder of the village, the great clock of the borough of Fundafatimitis. And this is the object to which the eyes of the old gentlemen are turned who sit in the leather-bottomed arm-chairs. The great clock has 7 faces, one in each of the 7 sides of the steeple, so that it can be readily seen from all quarters. Its faces are large and white, and its hands heavy and black. There is a belfry man, whose sole duty is to attend to it, but this duty is the most perfect of sinecures, for the clock of Fundafatimitis was never yet known to have anything the matter with it. Until lately the bare supposition of such a thing was considered heretical. From the remotest period of antiquity to which the archives have reference, the hours have been regularly struck by the big bell, and indeed the case was just the same with all the other clocks and watches in the borough. Never was such a place for keeping the true time. When the large clapper thought proper to say 12 o'clock, all its obedient followers opened their throats simultaneously, and responded like a very echo. In short, the good burghers were fond of their sauerkraut, but then they were proud of their clocks. All people who hold sinecure offices are held in more or less respect, and as the belfry man of Fundafatimitis has the most perfect of sinecures, he is the most perfectly respected of any man in the world. He is the chief dignitary of the borough, and the very pigs look up to him with a sentiment of reverence. His coat-tail is very far longer, his pipe, his shoe-buckles, his eyes, and his stomach very far bigger than those of any other old gentleman in the village, and as to his chin, it is not only double, but triple. I have thus painted the happy estate of Fundafatimitis. Alas, that so fair a picture should ever experience a reverse. There has been long a saying among the wisest inhabitants, that no good can come from over the hills, and it really seemed that the words had in them something of the spirit of prophecy. It wanted 5 minutes of noon on the day before yesterday, when there appeared a very odd-looking object on the summit of the ridge of the eastward. Such an occurrence, of course, attracted universal attention, and every little old gentleman who sat in a leather-bottomed armchair turned one of his eyes with a stare of dismay upon the phenomenon, still keeping the other upon the clock in the steeple. By the time that it wanted only 3 minutes to noon, the droll object in question was perceived to be a very diminutive, foreign-looking young man. He descended the hills at a great rate, so that everybody had soon a good look at him. He was really the most finicky little personage that had ever been seen in Vondervottimitis. His countenance was of a dark snuff-colour, and he had a long hooked nose, pea-eyes, a wide mouth, and an excellent set of teeth, which latter he seemed anxious of displaying, as he was grinning from ear to ear. What with mustachios and whiskers, there was none of the rest of his face to be seen. His head was uncovered, and his hair neatly done up in papillotes. His dress was a tight-fitting, swallow-tailed black coat, from one of whose pockets dangled a vast length of white handkerchief. Black kerseymere knee-breeches, black stockings, and stumpy-looking pumps, with huge bunches of black satin ribbon for bows. Under one arm he carried a huge chapeau de bras, and under the other a fiddle, nearly 5 times as big as himself. In his left hand was a gold snuff-box, from which, as he capered down the hill, cutting all manner of fantastic steps, he took snuff incessantly, with an air of the greatest possible self-satisfaction. God bless me! Here was a sight for the honest burghers of Vondervottimitis. To speak plainly, the fellow had, in spite of his grinning, an audacious and sinister kind of face, and as he curveted right into the village, the old stumpy appearance of his pumps excited no little suspicion, and many a burgher who beheld him that day would have given a trifle for a peep beneath the white cambric handkerchief, which hung so obtrusively from the pocket of his swallow-tail coat. But what mainly occasioned a righteous indignation was that the scoundrelly popinjay, while he cut a fandango here and a whirligig there, did not seem to have the remotest idea in the world of such a thing as keeping time in his steps. The good people of the borough had scarcely a chance, however, to get their eyes thoroughly open, when just as it wanted half a minute of noon, the rascal bounced, as I say, right into the midst of them, gave a chassé here and a balancé there, and then, after a pirouette and a pas de zephyr, pigeon-winged himself right up into the belfry of the house of the town council, where the wonder-stricken Belfry man sat smoking in a state of dignity and dismay. But the little chap seized him at once by the nose, gave it a swing and a pull, clapped the big chapeau de bras upon his head, knocked it down over his eyes and mouth, and then, lifting up the big fiddle, beat him with it so long and so soundly that, what with the Belfry man being so fat and the fiddle being so hollow, you would have sworn that there was a regiment of double-bass drummers all beating the devil's tattoo up in the belfry of the steeple of Vondervottimitis. There is no knowing to what desperate act of vengeance this unprincipled attack might have aroused the inhabitants, but for the important fact that it now wanted only half a second of noon. The bell was about to strike, and it was a matter of absolute and preeminent necessity that everybody should look well at his watch. It was evident, however, that just at this moment the fellow in the steeple was doing something that he had no business to do with the clock. But as it now began to strike, nobody had any time to attend to his manoeuvres, for they had all to count the strokes of the bell as it sounded. 1, said the clock. 1, echoed every little old gentleman in every leather-bottomed armchair in Vondervottimitis. 1, said his watch also. "One," said the watch of his vrouw, and "One," said the watches of the boys, and the little gilt repeaters on the tails of the cat and the pig. "Two," continued the big bell, and "Do," repeated all the repeaters. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, said the bell. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, answered the others. 11, said the big one. 11, assented the little ones. 12, said the bell. 12, they replied, perfectly satisfied, and dropping their voices. And 12 it is, said all the little old gentlemen, putting up their watches. But the big bell had not done with them yet. 13, said he. Der Teufel! Gasped the little old gentlemen, turning pale, dropping their pipes and putting down all their right legs from over their left knees. Der Teufel! groaned they. 13! 13! Mein Gott! It is 13 o'clock! Why attempt to describe the terrible scene which ensued? All Vondervotteimittis flew at once into a lamentable state of uproar. "What is come to mein Pelle?" roared all the boys. "I've been hungry for this hour. What is come to mein kraut?" screamed all the vrouws. "It has been done to rags for this hour." "What is come to mein pipe?" swore all the little old gentlemen. "Dunder und Blitzen! It has been smoked out for this hour!" And they filled them up again in a great rage, and sinking back in their armchairs, puffed away so fast and so fiercely that the whole valley was immediately filled with impenetrable smoke. Meantime the cabbages had all turned very red in the face, and it seemed as if old Nick himself had taken possession of everything in the shape of a timepiece. The clocks carved upon the furniture took to dancing, as if bewitched, whilst those upon the mantelpiece could scarcely contain themselves for fury, and kept such a continual striking of 13, and such a frisking and wriggling of their pendulums as was horrible to see. But worse than all, neither the cats nor the pigs could put up any longer with the behaviour of the little repeaters tied to their tails, and resented it by scampering all over the place, scratching and poking, and squeaking and screeching, and caterwauling and squalling, and flying into the faces and running under the petticoats of the people, and creating altogether the most abominable din and confusion which it is possible for a reasonable person to conceive. And to make matters still more distressing, the rascally little scapegrace in the steeple was evidently exerting himself to the utmost. Every now and then one might catch a glimpse of the scoundrel through the smoke. There he sat in the belfry, upon the Belfry Man, who was lying flat upon his back. In his teeth the villain held the bell-rope, which he kept jerking about with his head, raising such a clatter that my ears ring again even to think of it. On his lap lay the big fiddle at which he was scraping, out of all time and tune, with both hands making a great show, the nincompoop, of playing Judy O'Flanagan and Paddy O'Rafferty. Affairs being thus miserably situated, I left the place in disgust, and now appeal for aid to all lovers of correct time and fine kraut. Let us proceed in a body to the borough, and restore the ancient order of things in Vondervotteimittis by ejecting that little fellow from the steeple.
Was it a dream? By Guy de Maupassant. Read by Garrick Hagan. I had loved her madly. Why does one love? Why does one love? How queer it is to see only one being in the world, to have only one thought in one's mind. only one desire in the heart, and only one name on the lips. A name which comes up continually, rising like the water in a spring from the depths of the soul to the lips. A name which one repeats over and over again, which one whispers ceaselessly, everywhere, like a prayer. I am going to tell you our story, for love has only one, which is always the same. I met her and loved her. That's all. And for a whole year I have lived on her tenderness, on her caresses, in her arms, on her words, so completely wrapped up, bound, and absorbed in everything which came from her that I no longer cared whether it was day or night, or whether I was dead or alive on this old earth of ours. And then she died. How? I do not know. I no longer know anything. But one evening she came home wet, for it was raining heavily, and the next day she coughed, and she coughed for about a week, and took to her bed. What happened I do not remember now, but doctors came, wrote, and went away. Medicines were brought, and some women made her drink them. Her hands were hot, her forehead was burning, and her eyes bright and sad. When I spoke to her, she answered me, but I do not remember what we said. I have forgotten everything. Everything. She died, and I very well remember her slight, feeble sigh. The nurse said, "Ah," and I understood. I understood. I knew nothing more. I saw a priest who said, "Your mistress?" and it seemed to me as if he were insulting her. As she was dead, nobody had the right to say that any longer, and I turned him out. Another came who was very kind and tender, and I shed tears when he spoke to me about her. They consulted me about the funeral, but I do not remember anything that they said, though I recollected the coffin and the sound of the hammer when they nailed her down in it. Oh, God, God. She was buried in that hole. Some people came, female friends. I made my escape and ran away. I ran and then walked through the streets, went home, and the next day started on a journey. Yesterday I returned to Paris, and when I saw my room again, our room, our bed, our furniture, everything that remains of the life of a human being after death, I was seized by such a violent attack of fresh grief that I felt like opening the window and throwing myself out into the street. I could not remain any longer among these things, between these walls which had enclosed and sheltered her, which retained 1,000 atoms of her skin and of her breath in their imperceptible crevices. I took up my hat to make my escape, and just as I reached the door, I passed the large glass in the hall, which she had put there so that she might look at herself every day from head to foot as she went out, to see if her toilette looked well and was correct and pretty, from her little boots to her bonnet. I stopped short in front of that looking-glass, in which she had so often been reflected that it must have retained her reflection. I was standing there, trembling, with my eyes fixed on the glass, on that flat, profound, empty glass, which had contained her entirely, and had possessed her as much as my passionate looks had. I felt as if I loved that glass. I touched it. It was cold. I went out without knowing it, without wishing it, and toward the cemetery. I found her simple grave, a white marble cross, with these few words: "She loved, was loved, and died." She is there, below, decayed. How horrible! I sobbed with my forehead on the ground, and I stopped there for a long time. A long time. Then I saw that it was getting dark, and a strange, mad wish, the wish of a despairing lover, seized me. I wished to pass the night, the last night, in weeping on her grave. But I should be seen and driven out. How was I to manage? I was cunning, and got up and began to roam about in that city of the dead. I walked and walked. How small this city is, in comparison with the other, the city in which we live, and yet how much more numerous the dead are than the living. We want high houses, wide streets, and much room for the 4 generations who see the daylight at the same time, drink water from the spring, and wine from the vines, and eat bread from the plains. And for all the generations of the dead, for all that ladder of humanity that is descended down to us, there is scarcely anything. Anything. The earth takes them back, and oblivion effaces them. Adieu. At the end of the cemetery, I suddenly perceived that I was in its oldest part, where those who had been dead a long time are mingling with the soil, where the crosses themselves are decayed, where possibly newcomers will be put tomorrow. It is full of untended roses, of strong and dark cypress trees, a sad and beautiful garden, nourished on human flesh. I was alone, perfectly alone. So I crouched in a green tree and hid myself there completely, amid the thick and somber branches. I waited, clinging to the stem, like a shipwrecked man does to a plank. When it was quite dark, I left my refuge and began to walk softly, slowly, inaudibly, through that ground full of dead people. I wandered about for a long time, but could not find her tomb again. I went on with extended arms, knocking against the tombs with my hands, my feet, my knees, my chest, even with my head, without being able to find her. I groped about like a blind man finding his way. I felt the stones, the crosses, the iron railings, and the wreaths of faded flowers. I read the names with my fingers, by passing them over the letters. What a night! I could not find her again. There was no moon. I was frightened, horribly frightened in these narrow paths, between 2 rows of graves. Graves, nothing but graves. I sat down on one of them, for I could not walk any longer. My knees were so weak. I could hear my heart beat. And I heard something else as well. What? A confused, nameless noise. Was the noise in my head, in the impenetrable night, or beneath the mysterious earth, the earth sown with human corpses? I looked all around me, but I cannot say how long I remained there. I was paralyzed with terror, cold with fright, ready to shout out, ready to die. Suddenly it seemed to me that the slab of marble on which I was sitting was moving. Certainly it was moving, as if it were being raised. With a bound, I sprang onto the neighboring tomb, and I saw, yes, I distinctly saw the stone which I had just quitted rise upright. Then the dead person appeared, a naked skeleton, pushing the stone away with its bent back. I saw it quite clearly, although the night was so dark. On the cross I could read, "Here lies Jacques Ollivant, who died at the age of 51. He loved his family, was kind and honorable, and died in the grace of the Lord." The dead man also read what was inscribed on his tombstone. Then he picked up a stone off the path, a little pointed stone, and began to scrape the letters carefully. He slowly effaced them, and with the hollows of his eyes he looked at the places where they had been engraved. Then, with the tip of the bone that had been his forefinger, he wrote in luminous letters, like those lines which boys trace on walls with the tip of a lucifer match. "Here reposes Jacques Ollivant, who died at the age of 51. He hastened his father's death by his unkindness, as he wished to inherit his fortune. He tortured his wife, tormented his children, deceived his neighbors, robbed every one he could, and died wretched." When he had finished writing, the dead man stood motionless, looking at his work. On turning round, I saw that all the graves were open, that all the dead bodies had emerged from them, and that all had effaced the lies inscribed on the gravestones by their relations, substituting the truth instead. And I saw that all had been the tormentors of their neighbors, malicious, dishonest hypocrites, liars, rogues, calumniators, that they had stolen, deceived, performed every disgraceful, every abominable action, these good fathers, these faithful wives, these devoted sons, these chaste daughters, these honest tradesmen, these men and women who were called irreproachable. They were all writing at the same time, on the threshold of their eternal abode, the truth, the terrible and the holy truth of which everybody was ignorant or pretended to be ignorant while they were alive. I thought that she also must have written something on her tombstone. And now, running without any fear among the half-open coffins, among the corpses and skeletons, I went toward her, sure that I should find her immediately. I recognized her at once, without seeing her face, which was covered by the winding sheet. And on the marble cross, where shortly before I had read, "She loved, was loved, and died," I now saw, "Having gone out in the rain one day, in order to deceive her lover, she caught cold and died." It appears that they found me at daybreak, lying on the grave, unconscious.
Mad by Guy de Maupassant, read by Derek Jacobi.
Am I mad or jealous? I know not which, but I suffer horribly. I committed a crime, it is true, a mad crime. But are not insane jealousy, passionate love, betrayed and lost, and the terrible pain I endure enough to make anyone commit a crime, without actually being a criminal? Oh, I have suffered continually, acutely, terribly. I have loved this woman to madness. And yet is it true? Did I love her? No, she owned me, body and soul. I was and am her plaything. She ruled me by her smile, her look, the divine form of her body. I fight against the domination of her physical appearance, but the woman contained in that body I despise, hate, and execrate. I always have hated, despised, and execrated her, for she is but an impure, perfidious, bestial, filthy creature, the woman of perdition, the treacherous, sensual animal in whom there is no soul. She is the human animal, even less than that. She is but a mass of soft flesh in which dwells infamy. The first few months of our union were deliciously strange. In her arms I was exhausted by the frenzy of insatiable desire. Her eyes drew my lips as though they could quench my thirst. They were grey at noon, shaded green at twilight, and blue at sunrise. I am not mad, I swear they were of these three colours. In moments of love they were blue, as though they had been bruised. The pupils dilated and nervous. Her lips trembled, and often the tip of her pink, moist tongue could be seen quivering like that of a snake. Her heavy eyelids would be slowly raised, revealing that ardent, languorous look which used to madden me. When I took her in my arms, I used to gaze into her eyes, trembling, seized not only with an unceasing desire to possess her, but also to kill this beast. When she walked across the room, each step resounded in my heart, and when she began to undress, her dress falling from her, and emerged, infamous but radiant from the white mass of linen and lace, I felt in all my limbs, in my legs and arms, in my panting chest, an infinite and cowardly weakness. One day I saw that she was tired of me. I saw it in her eyes on waking. Leaning over her, I awaited this first look of hers every morning. I awaited it, filled with hatred, rage, and contempt for this sleeping brute whose slave I was. But when she fixed those pale, limpid blue eyes upon me, that languishing glance, tired with the lassitude of recent caresses, a rapid fire consumed me, exasperating my desires. When she opened her eyes that day, I saw a dull, indifferent look, a look devoid of desire, and I knew then she was tired of me. I saw it, knew it, felt it, and understood immediately that all was over, and each hour and minute proved to me that I was right. When I beckoned her with my arms and lips, she shrank from me. "Leave me alone," she said. "You are horrid. Will you never leave me alone?" Then I became jealous. Slyly, suspiciously, secretly jealous, like a dog. I knew she would soon be aroused again, that another man would excite her passions. I was insanely jealous. But I am not insane. No, indeed. I watched her and waited. Not that she had betrayed me, but she was cold and indifferent. At times she would say, "Men disgust me." Alas, it was too true. Then I became jealous of her very existence, of her indifference, of her nights alone, of her actions, of her thoughts, which I knew to be impure, jealous of all that my imagination suspected. And when she awakened sometimes with that same look of lassitude which used to follow our ardent nights, as though some desire had haunted her mind and stirred her passions, I suffocated with anger and an irresistible desire to choke her, to break her with my knee, to seize her by the throat and make her confess the shameful secrets of her heart took hold of me. Am I insane? No. One night I saw that she was happy. I felt, in fact I was convinced, that a new passion ruled her. She was trembling as she used to do after my caresses. Her eyes shone, she was feverish, and her whole being gave out that odour of desire which used to drive me mad. I feigned ignorance, but I watched her closely. I discovered nothing, however. I waited a week, a month, almost a year. She expanded in the joy of an inexplicable ardour, and was soothed by the happiness of some elusive caress. At last I guessed. No, I am not insane. I swear I am not. How can I explain this inconceivable, horrible thing? How can I make myself understood? This is how I guessed. She came in one night from a long ride on horseback, and sank exhausted in a seat facing me. An unnatural flush tinted her cheeks, her breast was heaving, her legs trembling, and her eyes were swollen. I was not mistaken. I had seen her look like that. She loved. I almost lost my head, and so as not to look at her, I turned to the window. A valet was leading her horse to the stable, and she stood and watched the prancing, fiery animal disappear. Then she fell asleep almost immediately. I thought and thought all night. My mind wandered through mysteries too deep to conceive. Who can fathom the perversity and strange caprices of a sensual woman? Who can understand their incredible caprices and strange satisfactions of the strangest fancies? Every morning, at dawn, she set out at a gallop across the fields and through the woods and dales, and each time she came back languid, as though exhausted by love. At last I understood. It was of the horse I was jealous, of the wind which caressed her face, of the drooping leaves, and of the sunbeams which touched her forehead through the branches, of the saddle which carried her, and felt the clasp of her thighs. It was all those things which made her so happy and brought her back to me satiated, exhausted. I resolved to be revenged. I became very attentive. Every time she came back from her ride, I helped her down, and the horse made a vicious rush at me. She would pat him on the neck, kiss his quivering nostrils without even wiping her lips, and the perfume of her body, warmed as though she had been in bed, mingled in my nostrils with the strong animal smell of the horse. I waited for chance. She used to take the same path every morning through a little birch wood, which finally lost itself in the forest. I got up before dawn, took a rope in my hands, and hid my pistols in my breast as if I were going to fight a duel. I ran to the path she loved so well. I drew the rope across, tied it to 2 trees, and then hid in the grass. With my ear to the ground, I heard her galloping in the distance. Then, under the trees like an arch, I saw her coming at a furious pace. Her cheeks flushed, an insane look in her eyes. She seemed enraptured, transported into another sphere. I was not mistaken. The rapid ride gave her senses a thrill of solitary pleasure. The animal struck the rope with his 4 feet and fell. I caught her in my arms, for I am strong enough to lift an ox, and then I approached the horse who was watching us. And while he again tried to bite me, I put my pistol close to his ear and shot him, as I would a man. She turned on me, and dealt me 2 terrific blows across the face with her riding whip, which felled me. And as she rushed at me again, I shot her. Tell me, am I insane?
The Monkey's Paw by W. W. Jacobs, read by Patrick Malahide.
Without, the night was cold and wet, but in the small parlour of Laburnum Villa the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were at chess. The former, who possessed ideas about the game involving radical changes, putting his king into such sharp and unnecessary perils that it even provoked comment from the white-haired old lady knitting placidly by the fire. "Hark at the wind," said Mr. White, who, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was amiably desirous of preventing his son from seeing it. "I'm listening. said the latter, grimly surveying the board as he stretched out his hand. "Check." "I should hardly think he'd come tonight," said his father, with his hand poised over the board. "Mate," replied the son. "Well, that's the worst of living so far out," bawled Mr. White, with sudden and unlooked-for violence. "Of all the beastly, slushy, out-of-the-way places to live, this is the worst. Paths are bog and the roads a torrent. I don't know what people are thinking about. I suppose because only 2 houses in the road are let, they think it doesn't matter." "Never mind, dear," said his wife soothingly. "Perhaps you'll win the next one." Mr. White looked up sharply, just in time to intercept a knowing glance between mother and son. The words died away on his lips, and he hid a guilty grin in his thin grey beard. "There he is," said Herbert White, as the gate banged too loudly and heavy footsteps came towards the door. The old man rose with hospitable haste, and opening the door was heard condoling with the new arrival. The new arrival also condoled with himself, so that Mrs. White said, "Tut, tut," and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, burly man, beady of eye and rubicund of visage. "Sergeant Major Morris," he said, introducing him. The Sergeant Major shook hands and, taking the proffered seat by the fire, watched contentedly while his host got out whisky and tumblers and stood a small copper kettle on the fire. At the 3rd glass his eyes got brighter, and he began to talk, the little family circle regarding with eager interest this visitor from distant parts, as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of wild scenes and doughty deeds, of wars and plagues and strange peoples. 21 years of it," said Mr. White, nodding at his wife and son. "When he went away he was a slip of a youth in a warehouse. Now look at him." "He don't look to have taken much harm," said Mrs. White, politely. "Well, I'd like to go to India myself," said the old man. "Just to look around a bit, you know." "Better where you are," said the Sergeant Major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass, and sighing softly, shook it again. "Well, I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and jugglers," said the old man. "What was that you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something, Morris?" "Nothing," said the soldier hastily. "Leastways, nothing worth hearing." "Monkey's paw?" said Mrs. White curiously. "Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps," said the Sergeant Major off-handedly. His 3 listeners leant forward eagerly. The visitor absent-mindedly put his empty glass to his lips and then set it down again. His host filled it for him. "To look at," said the Sergeant Major, fumbling in his pocket, "it's just an ordinary little paw, dried to mummy." He took something out of his pocket and proffered it. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. "And what is the special about it?" inquired Mr. White, as he took it from his son, and having examined it, placed it upon the table. "It had a spell put on it by an old fakir," said the Sergeant Major. "A very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it." His manner was so impressive that his hearers were conscious that their light laughter jarred somewhat. "Well, why don't you have 3, sir?" said Herbert White cleverly. The soldier regarded him in the way that Middle Age is wont to regard presumptuous youth. "I have," he said quietly, and his blotchy face whitened. "And did you really have the 3 wishes granted?" asked Mrs. White. "I did," said the Sergeant Major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth. "And has anybody else wished?" persisted the old lady. "The first man had his 3 wishes, yes," was the reply. "I don't know what the first 2 were, but the 3rd was for death. That's how I got the paw." His tones were so grave that a hush fell upon the group. "Well, if you've had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then, Morris," said the old man at last. "What do you keep it for?" The soldier shook his head. Fancy, I suppose, he said slowly. I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It's caused enough mischief already. Besides, people won't buy. They'll think it's a fairy tale, some of them, and those who do think anything of it want to try it first and pay me afterward. Well, if you could have another 3 wishes, said the old man, eyeing him keenly. Would you have 'em? I don't know, said the other. I don't know. He took the paw, and dangling it between his forefinger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. White, with a slight cry, stooped down and snatched it off. Better let it burn, said the soldier solemnly. Why, if you don't want it, Morris, said the other, give it to me. I won't, said his friend doggedly. I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it on the fire again, like a sensible man. The other shook his head and examined his new possession closely. How'd you do it? He inquired. Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud, said the sergeant-major. But I warn you of the consequences. Well, sounds like the Arabian Nights, said Mrs. White as she rose and began to set the supper. Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me? Her husband drew the talisman from his pocket, and then all 3 burst into laughter, as the sergeant-major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm. If you must wish, he said gruffly, wish for something sensible. Mr. White dropped it back in his pocket, and, placing chairs, motioned his friend to the table. In the business of supper, the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterward the 3 sat listening in an enthralled fashion to a second instalment of the soldier's adventures in India. Oh, if the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he's been telling us, said Herbert as the door closed behind their guest just in time to catch the last train, we shan't make much out of it. Did you give him anything for it, father? Inquired Mrs. White, regarding her husband closely. Well, a trifle, said he, colouring slightly. Well, he didn't want it, but I made him take it, and he pressed me again to throw it away. Likely, said Herbert with pretended horror. Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy. I wish to be an emperor, father, to begin with, and then you can't be henpecked. He darted round the table, pursued by the maligned Mrs. White, armed with an antimacassar. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously. I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact, he said slowly. Seems to me I've got all I want. Well, if you only cleared the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you? Said Herbert with his hand on his shoulder. Well, wish for £200 then. That'll just do it. His father, smiling shamefacedly at his own credulity, held up the talisman, as his son, with a solemn face, somewhat marred by a wink at his mother, sat down at the piano and struck a few impressive chords. I wish for £200, said the old man distinctly. A fine crash from the piano greeted the words, interrupted by a shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran towards him. It moved, he cried, with a glance of disgust at the object as it lay on the floor. As I wished it twisted in my hand like a snake. Well, I don't see the money, said his son as he picked it up and placed it on the table, and I bet I never shall. It must have been your fancy, father, said his wife, regarding him anxiously. He shook his head. Well, never mind, though. There's no harm done, but it gave me a shock all the same. They sat down by the fire again while the 2 men finished their pipes. Outside the wind was higher than ever, and the old man started nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs. A silence unusual and depressing settled upon all 3, which lasted until the old couple rose to retire for the night. I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed, said Herbert as he bade them good night, and something horrible squatting up on top of the wardrobe watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains. He sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire, and seeing faces in it. The last face was so horrible and so simian that he gazed at it in amazement. It got so vivid that, with a little uneasy laugh, he felt on the table for a glass containing a little water to throw over it. His hand grasped the monkey's paw, and with a little shiver he wiped his hand on his coat and went up to bed. In the brightness of the wintry sun next morning, as it streamed over the breakfast table, he laughed at his fears. There was an air of prosaic wholesomeness about the room, which it had lacked on the previous night, and the dirty, shrivelled little paw was pitched on the sideboard with a carelessness which betokened no great belief in its virtues. "I suppose all old soldiers are the same," said Mrs. White. "The idea of our listening to such nonsense! How could wishes be granted in these days? And if they could, how could £200 hurt your father?" "Might drop on his head from the sky," said the frivolous Herbert. "Morris said the things happen so naturally," said his father, "that you might, if you so wished, attribute it to coincidence." "Well, don't break into the money before I come back," said Herbert as he rose from the table. "I'm afraid it'll turn you into a mean, avaricious man, and we shall have to disown you." His mother laughed, and, following him to the door, watched him down the road, and, returning to the breakfast table, was very happy at the expense of her husband's credulity. All of which did not prevent her from scurrying to the door at the postman's knock, nor prevent her from referring somewhat shortly to retired sergeant-majors of bibulous habits when she found that the post brought a tailor's bill. "Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home," she said, as they sat at dinner. "I dare say," said Mr. White, pouring himself out some beer. "But for all that, the thing moved in my hand, that I'll swear to." "You thought it did," said the old lady soothingly. "I say it did," replied the other. "There was no thought about it. I just... What's the matter?" His wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside, who, peering in an undecided fashion at the house, appeared to be trying to make up his mind to enter. In mental connection with the £200, she noticed that the stranger was well dressed, and wore a silk hat of glossy newness. 3 times he paused at the gate, and then walked on again. The 4th time he stood with his hand upon it, and then, with sudden resolution, flung it open and walked up the path. Mrs. White at the same moment placed her hands behind her, and, hurriedly unfastening the strings of her apron, put that useful article of apparel beneath the cushion of her chair. She brought the stranger, who seemed ill at ease, into the room. He gazed at her furtively and listened in a preoccupied fashion as the old lady apologized for the appearance of the room and her husband's coat, a garment which he usually reserved for the garden. She then waited as patiently as her sex would permit for him to broach his business, but he was at first strangely silent. "I was asked to call," he said at last, and stooped and picked a piece of cotton from his trousers. "I come from Moore and Meggin's." The old lady started. "Is anything the matter?" she asked breathlessly. "Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it?" Her husband interposed. There, mother," he said hastily. "Sit down. Don't jump to conclusions. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir." And he eyed the other wistfully. "I'm sorry," began the visitor. "Is he hurt?" demanded the mother wildly. The visitor bowed in assent. "Badly hurt," he said quietly, "but he is not in any pain." "Oh, thank God," said the old woman, clasping her hands. "Thank God for that. She broke off suddenly as the sinister meaning of the assurance dawned upon her, and she saw the awful confirmation of her fears in the other's averted face. She caught her breath, and turning to her slower-witted husband, laid her trembling old hand upon his. There was a long silence. "He was caught in the machinery," said the visitor at length in a low voice. "Caught in the machinery," repeated Mr. White in a dazed fashion. "Yes." He sat staring blankly out at the window, and taking his wife's hand between his own, pressed it, as he had been wont to do in their old courting days nearly 40 years before. "He was the only one left to us," he said, turning gently to the visitor. It's hard. The other coughed and, rising, walked slowly to the window. The firm wished me to convey their sincere sympathy with you in your great loss, he said without looking round. I beg that you will understand that I am only their servant and merely obeying orders. There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring, and her breath inaudible. On the husband's face was a look such as his friend the sergeant might have carried into his first action. I was to say that Moore and Meggins disclaim all responsibility, continued the other. They admit no liability at all, but in consideration of your son's services, they wish to present you with a certain sum as compensation. Mr. White dropped his wife's hand, and rising to his feet gazed with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the words. How much? £200, was the answer. Unconscious of his wife's shriek, the old man smiled faintly, put out his hands like a sightless man, and dropped, a senseless heap, to the floor. In the huge new cemetery, some 2 miles distant, the old people buried their dead, and came back to the house, steeped in shadow and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly realize it, and remained in a state of expectation as though of something else to happen, something else which was to lighten this load, too heavy for old hearts to bear. But the days passed, and expectation gave place to resignation, the hopeless resignation of the old, sometimes miscalled apathy. Sometimes they hardly exchanged a word, for now they had nothing to talk about, and their days were long to weariness. It was about a week after that the old man, waking suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand and found himself alone. The room was in darkness, and the sound of subdued weeping came from the window. He raised himself in bed and listened. "Come back," he said tenderly. "You'll be cold." "It's colder for my son," said the old woman, and wept afresh. The sound of her sobs died away on his ears. The bed was warm, and his eyes heavy with sleep. He dozed fitfully, and then slept, until a sudden wild cry from his wife awoke him with a start. "The paw!" she cried wildly. "The monkey's paw!" He started up in alarm. Where is it? What's the matter?" She came stumbling across the room toward him. "I want it," she said quietly. "You've not destroyed it?" "It's in the parlour, on the bracket," he replied, marvelling. "Why?" She cried and laughed together, and bending over, kissed his cheek. "I only just thought of it," she said hysterically. "Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it?" "Think of what?" he questioned. "The other 2 wishes," she replied rapidly. "We've only had one." "Was not that enough?" he demanded fiercely. "No," she cried triumphantly. "We'll have one more. Go down and get it quickly, and wish our boy alive again." The man sat up in bed and flung the bedclothes from his quaking limbs. "Good God, you're mad!" he cried, aghast. "Get it," she panted. "Get it quickly and wish. Oh, my boy, my boy." Her husband struck a match and lit the candle. "Get back to bed," he said unsteadily. You don't know what you're saying." "We had the first wish granted," said the old woman feverishly. "Why not the second?" A coincidence," stammered the old man. "Go and get it and wish," cried his wife, quivering with excitement. The old man turned and regarded her, and his voice shook. He's been dead 10 days, and besides, I'd not tell you else, but I could only recognise him by his clothing. If he was too terrible for you to see then, how now?" "Bring him back," cried the old woman, and dragged him toward the door. "Do you think I fear the child I've nursed?" He went down in the darkness and felt his way to the parlour, and then to the mantelpiece. The talisman was in its place, and a horrible fear that the unspoken wish might bring his mutilated son before him ere he could escape from the room seized upon him, and he caught his breath as he found that he had lost the direction of the door. His brow cold with sweat, he felt his way round the table and groped along the wall until he found himself in the small passage with the unwholesome thing in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed changed as he entered the room. It was white and expectant, and to his fears seemed to have an unnatural look upon it. He was afraid of her. "Wish!" she cried in a strong voice. "It's foolish and wicked," he faltered. "Wish!" repeated his wife. He raised his hand. "I wish my son alive again." The talisman fell to the floor, and he regarded it fearfully. Then he sank trembling into a chair as the old woman, with burning eyes, walked to the window and raised the blind. He sat until he was chilled with the cold, glancing occasionally at the figure of the old woman peering through the window. The candle end, which had burned below the rim of the china candlestick, was throwing pulsating shadows on the ceiling and walls, until, with a flicker larger than the rest, it expired. The old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the talisman, crept back to his bed, and a minute or two afterward the old woman came silently and apathetically beside him. Neither spoke, but lay silently listening to the ticking of the clock. A stair creaked, and a squeaky mouse scurried noisily through the wall. The darkness was oppressive, and after lying for some time, screwing up his courage, he took the box of matches and, striking one, went downstairs for a candle. At the foot of the stairs the match went out, and he paused to strike another. And at the same moment a knock, so quiet and stealthy as to be scarcely audible, sounded on the front door. The matches fell from his hand and spilled in the passage. He stood motionless, his breath suspended, until the knock was repeated. Then he turned and fled swiftly back to his room and closed the door behind him. A third knock sounded through the house. "What's that?" cried the old woman, starting up. "A rat," said the old man in shaking tones. "A rat. It passed me on the stairs." His wife sat up in bed listening. A loud knock resounded through the house. "It's Herbert!" she screamed. "It's Herbert!" She ran to the door, but her husband was before her, and catching her by the arm, held her tightly. "What are you going to do?" he whispered hoarsely. "It's my boy! It's Herbert!" she cried, struggling mechanically. "I forgot. It was 2 miles away. What are you holding me for? Let go. I must open the door." "For God's sake, don't let it in!" cried the old man, trembling. "You're afraid of your own son!" she cried, struggling. "Let me go. I'm coming, Herbert. I'm coming." There was another knock, and another. The old woman with a sudden wrench broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed to the landing and called after her appealingly as she hurried downstairs. He heard the chain rattle back and the bottom bolt drawn slowly and stiffly from the socket. Then the old woman's voice, strained and panting. "The bolt!" she cried loudly. "Come down! I can't reach it!" But her husband was on his hands and knees, groping wildly on the floor in search of the paw. If he could only find it before the thing outside got in. A perfect fusillade of knocks reverberated through the house, and he heard the scraping of a chair as his wife put it down in the passage against the door. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it came slowly back, and at the same moment he found the monkey's paw and frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking ceased suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard the chair drawn back and the door opened. A cold wind rushed up the staircase, and a long, loud wail of disappointment and misery from his wife gave him courage to run down to her side and then to the gate beyond. The street lamp flickering opposite shone on a quiet and deserted road.
Production copyright 2005 CSA Telltapes. All rights reserved. Licensed from CSA Word by the Audio Partners Publishing Corporation. The Audio Partners Publishing Corporation is pleased to be the publisher of many other classic stories, including Great American Stories, Great American Writers, and Great American Women's Fiction. For a free Audio Editions catalog offering thousands of audiobooks on cassette and compact disc from all major publishers, call toll-free 1-800-231-4261. Visit our website at www.audioeditions.com.